From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to Coast AM. Tonight, our JFK assassination program. Stand by for that. And here's what's happening. Oh, boy, more Americans will use food stamps to buy their Thanksgiving dinner this year than ever before, according to a new report from a not-for-profit government watchdog group. It's called the Sightlight Foundation. The Food Stamp Challenge, which challenges higher-income families to live as if they are on food stamps, estimates that a person on food stamps has a budget of about $1.25 a meal. In other words, a family on food stamps must buy an entire meal per person for less than the cost of an average cup of coffee. How in the heck do they do that? Hostess brands must return to a liquidation scenario after mediation with its bakers union failed to avert a shutdown that may eliminate more than 18,000 jobs. The judge overseeing the Twinkie makers' bankruptcy made all that public today, so it looks as if Hostess is going to go down the tubes after all. Militants took their fight with Israel into the heart of the country, exploding a bomb on a public transportation bus in Tel Aviv. The attack is likely to complicate already strained efforts to achieve a ceasefire there. The blast injured 22 people, shook up the Israeli public, and drew immediate condemnation from world leaders. Jerry Corsi, WorldNet Daily, with us. Jerry, this thing's not going away. I thought it would, but it's not.
It's not, George. And as we discussed before the election, the tensions in the Middle East were pretty much bound to spill over into violence after the election was over. And right now the question is whether or not the truce will hold.
What would make Hamas get onto a bus, attempt to blow it up, attempt to kill people when they're in the middle of all this stuff?
That was a provocative act, especially to expand the violence merely from firing rockets into Israel, which is frightening enough now that they can reach Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but also to explode a bus, an act of terrorism, really, especially as the truce was being negotiated, was very provocative. I mean, we've seen Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Prime Minister of Egypt, Morsi, really intervene and try to really bring some reason to the situation. Clearly, if Israel involved itself in a land incursion inside the Gaza, we would have a dramatic escalation of the violence. And I'm not certain that that's not going to happen yet in the near future, especially if Hamas continues to fire rockets into Israel.
And, you know, Jerry, we're not hearing much about Iran right now. How come?
Well, and again, George, the rockets that were being fired were manufactured in Iran.
Right.
Which means that they had to have been brought in through Egypt, which brings, again, another escalation of the potential for violence in the Middle East, because Iran remains a major force behind the terrorism, also with Hezbollah and Lebanon, supplied by Iran, and the violence continuing in Syria. The Middle East continues to be a tinderbox.
Jerry, you have a happy Thanksgiving with you and your family. Okay,
thank you, George, and the same to your great audience.
Jerry Corsi. Federal law enforcement agencies soon may have their hands tied when it comes to assessing your email and other personal data if a new bill currently making its way through Congress becomes law. Laws governing the privacy of your emails were drafted in the mid-1980s, long before AOL and Gmail, but efforts to update those rules have some fearing the government's fingers will be flipping through their digital mail. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairperson Patrick Leahy has drafted a substitute bill for the Electronics Communications Privacy Act, which was originally written in 1986, long before things like electronic archiving and storage came about. The update, which will be under review next Thursday, modernizes rules for police seeking to obtain private email for investigative purposes. Lauren Weinstein with us as he watches the Internet for us. What do you think of this one, Lauren?
Yeah, it's actually not cut and dried yet. The problem is that at the same time that there are these efforts to update the ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, to better control when the government has access to your stored email, because right now it depends on how old it is, it depends on where it's stored, it depends on whether or not you've opened it. There's all these different parameters. There's already pushback on the moves to close those loopholes from various law enforcement agencies and such, who say that the way it is right now isn't lax enough, that they actually want more access to people's email, not less. And it's very hard from the outside right now to know what's going to come through the Senate, because depending on who you talk to about this, Senator Leahy has taken different stances on this. There's different versions of the legislation. There's different drafts. It's still very fluid, and no one really knows what's going to come out. So this is not a situation. For a while there, it looked like this was going to be a really good, we're going to get this cleaned up and we're going to have more privacy on our email kind of situation. And it may still turn out that way, because obviously the controversy over General Petraeus has driven more action on this recently. But this is not a sure thing, and it's quite possible that at the last minute it'll go the other way, because there are very powerful interests who want to have more access to our email and not less.
And there's also plans afoot for governments to try to take over the internet, isn't there?
Oh, there's. I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings right before a holiday. I mean, everybody, please have a happy Thanksgiving. But in a couple of weeks now, the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, which is part of the UN, is having some meetings in Dubai, UAE, where, to put it in the simplest terms possible, they basically want the UN to take over the internet. Now, I don't cry wolf on any of these issues, but this is something that has, everyone that's worked with the internet for a short period of time, a long period of time, absolutely up in arms, because what the governments want to do, and this is largely being driven through a secret process at the ITU. The ITU has long been setting telecommunication standards and things like that. But it's a secret process, and we're basically learning things by leaks. It's largely being driven by Russia and China, who want to have, instead of the multi-stakeholder model that's been running the internet up till now, they want the national governments to have complete control through the UN in such a way that they could easily impose censorship and other kinds of oppression on the internet. If they succeed in doing that, the internet could turn into a mechanism for suppressing freedom rather than promoting freedom. Now, there is an effort now to make it clear that this is not something that's acceptable to people. Google just opened up a new website that explains what's going on, what people can do about it, and how to fight against this. And I have a link to that I've just put on myvortex.com, VORTEX.com website. It's in red. It says, Stop the UN's ITU Takeover of the Internet. And if people are interested in learning about this and what they can do, I'd recommend going there and reading about this, because this has been percolating for a long time, and now it's really a serious situation.
All right. Enjoy Turkey Day, Lauren.
You too, George. Everyone have a good Thanksgiving.
Super. And as you know, we'll have a live program for you on Thanksgiving night. Those of you who spend the Friday following Thanksgiving doing things like spending time with your family or working or volunteering or attempting to construct the world's greatest turkey leftover sandwich, Black Friday devotees are a mystery, and estimated, now get this, 147 million Americans plan to go shopping sometime this weekend, according to the National Retail Federation. But we shall see. Of course, they're looking for a great retail season. Let's see if they get it. How muscular you are as a teenager may predict how long you live, at least if you're a man. Swedish experts who tracked more than 1 million teenage boys for 24 years found that those with low muscle strength, weaker leg and arm muscles, and a limp grip were at increased risk of early death. City of Dallas will mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy next year with a ceremony featuring the tolling of church bells, a moment of silence, and readings by a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. The commemoration on November 22nd, 2013, will take place in Dealey Plaza, where Kennedy's motorcade through downtown Dallas was passing as those shots rang out. The ceremony will begin at 12:25 p.m. with the church bells across the city, followed by a moment of silence at 12:30 p.m., the time of the shooting. I was 13 years old when this all happened a long, long time ago, and always remember Walter Cronkite.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Cronkite broke down then. He took his glasses off. He was teary-eyed. It was quite a sight to behold. This country probably has never been the same since. The Warren Commission that investigated the president's death concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald fired at Kennedy's motorcade from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. They concluded he acted alone. But did he? Up next, Michael Cohen joins us. We'll be talking with him about his work on the JFK assassination next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Two special guests for you tonight as we talk about the JFK assassination. You're going to be involved as well. Each other hour, we're going to take your phone calls. Michael Cohen this hour with us and next as well with your calls, a retired New York City high school social studies teacher. He's been doing research all of his life on different topics, but the Kennedy assassination has been the most important. He was just 20 years old when President Kennedy was assassinated. Michael, welcome to Coast, Michael.
Thank you, George. George, you mind if I ask you a few questions about the Kennedy assassination?
Yeah, you can interview me, and then it's my turn with you. Go ahead.
Okay. It's the 49th year, of course, of his assassination. George, how many books have been published about the Kennedy assassination in the last 49 years?
I would say too many.
Yeah, right. Can you give me a number?
Oh, at least 20, 25, minimum, I'm guessing.
5 books? How about 6,500?
Oh, my gosh.
I got that from Amazon.com, by the way.
That's amazing.
Now, how many books do you think have been published about Lee Harvey Oswald in the last 49 years?
Probably the same amount, maybe?
No, 3,500.
Okay, close.
Okay. How many books have been published about the Warren Commission in the last 49 years?
Maybe 1,000?
2,000.
All right.
How many books have been published about LBJ being the prime instigator of the assassination, blaming him? How many books on them, you think?
Maybe 100?
180. Close. Very close.
How am I doing?
Very good. So we're up to about 12,000 books.
I can tell you're a teacher.
Yes. 12,000 books, in my opinion, a totally waste of time, totally useless. People don't know. Even today, people ask what happened, who killed them. 12,000 books, they don't answer the questions. So my whole life, I'm going through this business saying, what is the truth? What really happened in this assassination? And I think I uncovered it, maybe 80% of it. I don't get 100%, but I think I've covered most of it. I could fully document it from New York Times articles, which, by the way, were declared secret by the Warren Commission. A lot of this, believe it or not, a lot of newspaper articles and magazine articles were declared secret, though they don't tell you that. They keep that quiet. We know there's millions of documents out there that are secret. All right, let me tell you how I got involved with the woman who killed Kennedy.
All right.
Remember Madame Nhu, by the way? The
Vietnam.
dragon lady?
Vietnam, right?
Yeah, Vietnam. Do you remember? I don't know. I'm older than you, but do you remember the story?
I was 15 years old, I think, Michael. Right
Okay, you don't remember the stories. Okay.
No.
All right. Well, by the way, that's all planned. You're not supposed to remember this. It's all censorship. Since the assassination, her name has been obliterated from the history books. They keep people in ignorance about this. But I got to it. I got the information on it. And basically the way I found it was I went to the public library. All my work is done in the public library, by the way.
All right.
The stuff is in there. The documents are in there if you know what to look.
So what you're saying, what you're going to tell us tonight are things that you piece together. Is that right?
Right. That's correct. Basically, it comes from the New York Times, November 1963, about 5 articles in the New York Times. It's all based on that. And it's based on what this woman did, who she saw, what happened, who she talked to, like you trace a criminal, you do a forensic test and everything. And the evidence in these documents, as far as concerned, I think is absolute, that this woman, Madame Nhu, she came from Vietnam, instigated this plot basically all by herself, in a plot that involved most of the government officials involved, different agencies and everything, and the end result was the death of President Kennedy. She did this all in 20 days. I don't think James Bond in any movie could do what this woman did.
No, I don't think so either.
It could do something like this by herself. And I'll go into some details about this. 20 years of age, I was in college. I heard about Kennedy's death. My generation was greatly affected by it. Well, your generation, too.
Mine, too.
Okay. We never recovered from it. Over the years, I started buying books, conspiracy books that were coming out. I call it the JFK assassination industry. They keep pumping out these books every few weeks. Okay, so I'm reading these books as the years go by, and I see something's wrong with these books. It doesn't make sense. And what doesn't make sense is that I remember before Kennedy was killed, there were reports in the news about a woman, a very angry woman, who wanted to kill the President of the United States. And I couldn't remember a name, though. This is like 10 years afterwards or 15 years afterwards. Mm-hmm. So one day I'm in the public library and doing some work for my school, and I see the microfilm section. I said, hey, what do I got to lose? Pull November 1963 out of that, the film on that. By the way, you can't do this on a computer today. With all our advances, the microfilm is still better. So I took that microfilm out, put it in the machine, and I said, let me see if I could find that woman, that name of the woman, and what she did. So I started on November 1st, nothing. November 2nd, nothing. November 3rd, I nearly jumped out of my seat. There she was on the front page of the New York Times. Not only one article, 5 articles about her. And you say, well, why did the New York Times honor her? I guess it's an honor to be on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah. Why'd she be on the front page of the New York Times?
The day before, she held a live press conference on television and threatened to murder the President of the United States. That was enough to... Yeah.
Was she in Vietnam at the time, South Vietnam?
No. She was here. If she was in Vietnam, she would have been killed. Kennedy ordered her death.
She held a news conference, threatened to kill the president, and was never arrested for this?
Oh, not only never arrested, well, they erased her memory. Oh, yeah. That's correct. Matter of fact, the Warren Commission labeled her as a suspect for what she did on this news conference, but that was kept secret for 30 years. Her name doesn't appear in the 26 volumes. It only came out in 1993 after a few thousand pages were released. Remember after the Oliver Stone movie came out?
Right, I remember that.
So there was a lot of complaints about all these millions of documents. So they released about a few thousand documents. And then, of course, the media at the time said, oh, look, there's no conspiracy here. But they lied because they accidentally released her file. We didn't know she had a file with the Warren Commission. And you can look it up, by the way, on the Internet. You look up John F. Kennedy Assassination Records on Google, and you'll get to the National Archives and put her name in there. You'll see the stuff. The problem with her file was it was censored. There was only 10 items in the file. And, oh, by the way, in the file, it says she's a suspect. Actually says that.
I've never. This is an amazing revelation to me.
Oh, I'm telling you, it's amazing because the assassination industry cannot report this. They're on the orders not to talk about this. That's why, to you, it's amazing. To me, I got this stuff out. I could document all this. It's very easy to document this stuff. All right, now, in the file, there were 10 items. None of the newspaper articles I talked about were in that file. There were hundreds of articles on this woman. None of it was in there. All it was sketchy reports, some seaman in Turkey heard from somebody Madame Nhu killed him or something, some stupid things like that.
Well, explain this to us, Michael. Who was she exactly?
Okay, Madame Nhu. Yeah, I was going to get to that whole business. Madame Nhu ran South Vietnam along with her husband, President Diem, and his brother-in-law Nhu. The three of them ran South Vietnam. South Vietnam was always a big problem for us, especially in the early 60s. And what happened was you had a Catholic minority, 10% of the population, sitting on top of 90% who were Buddhists and mistreating them all the time.
Right.
And there was always problems with that situation. So she was the leader. The husband was the president. She was the first lady, but she dominated everything. She was in control of the situation. Eventually, that power led to a conflict with President Kennedy, and in the end, President Kennedy paid the price. This was a woman you did not cross. She was a tough woman, a strong woman, a combat veteran. In Vietnam, she was always under the gun. She had an army of 25,000 women soldiers protecting her. Just tell you what's going on. She didn't trust anybody, even her own army. In her obituary, I found one thing just recently. It never ends.
Hold on for a second, Michael. We're going to hit this quick break, and we're going to come right back to you on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. We're with Michael Cohen, who has put together some pieces here of a puzzle that I did not see before. This is fascinating work, Michael.
Okay. By the way, if you Google Madame Nhu's name, you'll see a number of articles on her. There's a Wikipedia article on her that's pretty accurate. Doesn't tell the whole story. And also the New York Times, when she died last year, did a big obituary on her. That's worthwhile to read, too. I was getting back to her
she spells
personality.
it Nhu, right? Her last name?
Yeah. Madame, M-A-D-A-M-E-N-H-U.
Okay.
Yeah, Google that. You'll see Wikipedia, and then you'll see the New York Times obituary, along with all the other obituaries.
Okay.
Anyway, let me get back to her personality. See what's, she was no Marilyn Monroe. Let's put it like this, She was a tough cookie, according to what I've read about her. For example, one of her generals, when she was running South Vietnam, threatened to kill her husband and make her his mistress. So she heard about this, and one day she's at a party, and that general was at the party. So she goes up to the general and says to him, "If you try this, I will personally rip your throat out."
Jeez.
This is what she told the general, and no more problem with that general. I'm just trying to explain what Kennedy was up to. In the summer of 1963, 4 months before Kennedy died, Kennedy and her got into a death struggle, a struggle for power and control that could only end in the death of one of these people, and it ended the death of Kennedy. Let me just give a little background of what happened. We had 30,000 troops fighting in Vietnam at the time. They were dying, being wounded, although we didn't call it a war. It was costing us $1 billion a week to run this thing, to save that government. This Catholic government there was in danger of collapsing. The communists Viet Cong were getting more powerful. And the Madame Nhu came up with an idea, but I think it might have came from the Vatican because she was Catholic. And her plan was she got to convert the 90% of the Buddhists to the Catholic religion. And the way to do it is you burn down their temples and kill off their monks. A simple process. Then the Buddhists would have to convert and become, Catholics. Okay. So she started this program, and when it started, President Kennedy got very nervous about this because the United Nations started getting involved with this business. Say, what's going on here with the Buddhists here in South Vietnam?
It's almost like genocide, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. By the way, her own father said that she was totally insane. This is her father. She was born a Buddhist, and she converted to the Catholic religion. Her father was a Buddhist, yet she turned on the Buddhists and murdered them by the thousands. Anyway, so the Buddhists at this point, were wanted to protest. The way they protested is, you may remember this, they burned themselves in the streets of Saigon, the monks. They poured gasoline over themselves.
That's right. They would sit down and burn themselves. That's right.
Do you remember those pictures? I don't know if you remember it.
I sure do. I'll never forget them.
Right. So they, they had photographers there taking pictures. These pictures went all over the world. Kennedy is getting nervous now. He's really upset, what's going on with this family and what Madame Nhu was doing. So he starts threatening them, and he says, "You got to stop this." Madame Nhu says, "Mr. President, you cannot tell me anything. This is an independent country. I could do what I want." As the monks were burning themselves, she started making wild statements. She said these burnings, she called them barbecues. And she made statements like, "The next time a monk wants to barbecue himself, I'll bring the mustard."
Oh, my God.
This went all over the world. These statements from a ruler of a country, this is unbelievable. Even the Ayatollah Khomeini, couldn't match this stuff. So a couple more statements were, "The next time a monk burns himself, I'll bring the gasoline and the matches." Or, "The next time a monk burns himself, I'll be clapping my hands." Kennedy went nuts. And he threatened her. And he says, "Shut your mouth. We don't need this. This is going all over the world. You're embarrassing us, America's fighting here, trying to save your government. And again, she says to Mr. Kennedy, I don't have to take orders from you. We are the legitimate government here in South Vietnam. 10% of the population, is the legitimate government.
Well, where's her husband at the time? Diem.
The husband kept his mouth shut. She did all the work. He was in the background.
He's the president, but
He's
she's doing all this.
He's the president, Diem, yes. He's the background. She did all the work. She was out front doing all the work. Okay, so he talks to her, not to the other two. Anyway, summer goes on. Summer 1963 goes on, this back and forth arguments with Kennedy and her. I call it a death struggle. In the end, one of them dies. Finally, towards the end of August, Kennedy says to her, a Donald Trump thing, Donald Trump, you're fired. He said to her, I got bad news for you, you three. You're out. Goodbye. Pack your bags. You're no longer the rulers here. Madame Nhu shot back to him and said, you can't talk to me like that. I run this country.
Well, she was right, wasn't she?
Well, yes and no, because she had a dictatorship. It wasn't a democracy. No. And the voting was all fixed. They never had an actual vote. It was all a joke. It was a dictatorship, a Catholic-run dictatorship, by the way.
Well, then Diem got assassinated. Her husband got assassinated later.
We're getting
right?
to that. I'm getting to that, all right? Before I get there, I just want to give a few more facts. Yes, in the end, Kennedy ordered a coup through the CIA, and what happened was her husband and and his brother, Nhu, had their hands tied behind their backs. They were forced to kneel, and both of them were shot in the back of the head with rifles.
Is it true? Yes, it does. Is it true that Kennedy was shocked that they were murdered? I think, did he want them just out of the country?
Well, you see, that part I couldn't really prove. We get all kinds of misinformation after that. My feeling was Kennedy wanted to kill Madame Nhu. You see, that was those two. He wanted to get her, but luckily she was in America at the time on tour. He couldn't get her, so they got the other two. I think if she was there, maybe they just would have killed her, and the other two, they just would have said goodbye,
Right.
That's my feeling about it.
Okay.
But she was the enemy. He hated her, and she hated him. Anyway, so in October of that year, she comes to America on tour. Now, at that point, she becomes a hero to the right wing in this country, the billionaire right wing. You hear that today. The conservatives, Richard Nixon, they loved her. The Catholic Church loved this woman. And they hated Kennedy, who's the liberal, who's a communist, and whatever. So she felt if she comes to America and tours, she could get enough support among the American people to fight Kennedy, make him change his plans.
Okay, and Kennedy must have been livid that she was here doing what she was doing.
Oh, he at first he thought he could stop her by denying her an entry visa, but there was too many complaints. There was pressure put on. She had a lot of support in the government. I mean, this woman, like today, some of these right-wing people, they worship this woman. She was out there fighting communism. This was a big thing in the Cold War.
It was huge then. Yep.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So anyway, a month goes by. She has tremendous interviews. If you go to Amazon.com, you'll see pictures of her. Life magazine, Time magazine, Newsweek, all had front-page covers on her. She's a very beautiful woman, by the way, at that time. And she had press conferences all the time. Where they meet the press with reporters, and each time she denounced Kennedy and said, he cannot do what he's doing to my country. This is ridiculous. Comes November 1st, and the assassination of her relatives take place. Now the fun begins, all right? The Kennedy administration said that they committed suicide. See what I said?
With their hands tied behind.
Yeah. Even Houdini would have a problem, I think, doing that, right? Anyway, so Madame Nhu holds a press conference, and in this press conference, what I'm saying is what she was saying in this was not she was going to threaten to kill the president. That's already been decided. So she's going to make him pay.
Did she have money, Michael? Was she a wealthy lady?
Billionaire.
Okay.
That's why she was able to pull off this conspiracy within the government to pay off. Yes, unlimited amount of funds. That played a big role in the way things were handled. We have a corrupt government, I hate to say it, and money talks.
Money talks.
And she knew that. And, anyway, I'll talk about Richard Nixon in a minute. I just want to talk about this business with this death thing here. It was in the New York Times. The transcript is on November 3rd edition, the third page, and it goes on and on. And, by the way, here, George, I'm going to give you the first sentence of what she said. I want your opinion of it.
Okay.
Whatever is done against Vietnam will be felt in America too. How do you interpret that sentence?
Well, her husband had been already killed, right?
Right.
To me, then, it would be what you've done here, we're going to do here.
Uh-huh. To who?
I would assume Kennedy.
That's correct.
It sounds like she was talking to Kennedy.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And she goes on with, she never mentions Kennedy's name in here. She calls it the administration.
Right. She's a smart lady.
Very intelligent. Crazy, but very intelligent and very shrewd politically. She survived 10 years in Vietnam, running a crazy country. She knew her stuff. All right, so she issues this death warrant over here, and it says in the Times here. Now, what I did next was I traced articles. There were 4 other articles on her in that month in the New York Times, and I went from article to article trying to place things together. A key article was a telephone call she got from her friend Richard Nixon.
Really?
And Richard Nixon, we know among the assassination people, he was there, right? You know the story. You want me to go over that little bit?
No, he was in Dallas, wasn't he?
That yes. One day a year, at 365 days, he was in Dallas the day Kennedy died.
And he hated Kennedy.
The Warren Commission asked him what he was doing there. Oh, I was on business. But there's another story. He was changing planes. What he was doing there was he was setting up his assassination teams. That's what he was doing. And Mr. E. Howard Hunt, as you know, was on one of those teams there in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, see, one of the problems these assassination books have is they all talk about this, you know, and also years later with E. Howard Hunt with the pictures of him, him at the assassination site. You know, we've been over this a lot. You've talked about this.
His deathbed confession. And
right. Deathbed confession. Now, these assassination books out there all mention that, but they can't go any further because there's a key they're missing. And the key they're missing is his relationship to her. This article proves that she was dealing with him. Now, this is what I think happened. She talked to him on this phone call, maybe other phone calls, and said, look, I want you to arrange the assassination of President Kennedy. I will give you unlimited amount of funds and money. You know where all the bodies are buried in Washington, you know, with these corrupt politicians and agency heads and everything. And you go to it. And she stipulated, though, there were 2 things that had to be done. The first thing was he had to die on November 22nd at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Why was that significant?
Well, because astrology. They went to an astrologer. And astrology played a big role in this. You've never heard of this before, did you?
No, you're going to have to tell us that, too.
Oh, that's another story they don't want you to know about with astrology on this. And the other thing she told Nixon to do is he has to be shot in the head for obvious reasons, right? Her husband was killed that way.
Her husband was killed that way.
Yeah. Now, Nixon, I think, knew enough people to put this whole thing together between the CIA, FBI. Well, of course, you had Allen Dulles, who was kicked out of the CIA by Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs. He hated him. She probably got him involved. He wound up in the Warren Commission to cover himself. And then, of course, J. Edgar Hoover hated him. By the way, J. Edgar Hoover sacrificed one of his agents, Lee Harvey Oswald, in the end. Oswald was an FBI agent. I'll get into that later if you have time to discuss that.
He was the patsy, as he said.
He was the patsy, but he was an FBI agent.
All right,
sacrificed by Hoover.
Sure.
So my only problem is I think what happened was he got in touch with Hoover and got in touch with Allen Dulles, and all 3 of them working together worked out this whole business, you know, in 20 days. The whole
now, they must have, if they were involved in this, Michael, they must have obviously hated Kennedy so much they wanted him dead even before she came on the picture, right?
It's no secret Hoover's attitudes or the Allen Dulles. That's well known, about that. But they needed motivation. They had to have somebody to motivate them. You see, she was the motivation. On their own, they wouldn't do this.
Well, and they needed cash
and unlimited funds. Whatever the money took, whatever it was, they paid off. One of the things they set up here, here's another thing they don't want to talk about in the assassination books. President Kennedy's funeral was rehearsed 1 week in advance while he was still alive.
What do you mean it was rehearsed?
Interesting story here. There's something. This is in the Warren Commission. I think it's Exhibit 1803. I went through this. I picked up interesting things like this that the other books will not talk about. All right. You saw the pictures of the funeral. You remember the funeral?
Yes.
You had horses, caisson with the coffin on it. marching bands, thousands of
little
soldiers.
John there saluting.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, all of that was rehearsed the week before. Yes, actually rehearsed. His funeral was rehearsed while he was still living. By the way, we just had a great election here, and they spent billions of dollars, trying to fight for the position of president. I don't think the president does such a great job if, as one of the benefits is, they rehearse your funeral in advance.
Well, now, did Kennedy know that they were rehearsing this funeral?
I don't think he did. Well, they covered themselves. They lied. Let me explain what happened with this. I was reading the stuff in the Warren Commission on this, and there was a right-wing professor who was giving testimony before the commission talking about this rehearsal business. He says the collaborators, the conspiracy people, wanted Kennedy to have a great funeral. Something like, remember Ben-Hur or Cleopatra, those movies?
Yeah.
They wanted to hypnotize the public. With such a funeral, they wouldn't think of what else is going on in the country, whatever corruption it was. And he gave evidence that a rehearsal did take place. Now, the Warren Commission was in trouble because their only purpose was to prove Lee Harvey Oswald was not a FBI agent. That's their only purpose.
They were backing into that whole story.
Right. This story blows the whole thing wide open because that means the only way you can rehearse President Kennedy's funeral has to be from the highest levels, and Robert McNamara, defense secretary, was the only one who could have ordered it. That's his friend and buddy, by the way, McNamara at the time. So anyway, they got in touch with the captain who ran the funeral rehearsal, and they asked him, they said, why were you rehearsing President Kennedy's funeral in advance? And he said, no, we weren't doing that. We were rehearsing former President Hoover's expected funeral in advance. Apparently Hoover was sick at the time. And then the captain says, but when Kennedy was killed, we were ready. Everything was set up.
It was the same thing, right?
Yeah, but where they lied, let me explain where the game is on this. The cover story was Hoover's funeral, expected funeral.
Right.
Hoover did not die till a year later. You see? They thought, the Warren Commission thought that would satisfy the people and forget about this funeral rehearsal. But it was there. It actually happened.
Let me tell you, Michael, I don't believe in coincidences. And here you have Diem dying November 1st, 1963.
Oh, yeah, 20 days.
20-some days later, Kennedy dies. I mean, it's just way too close. There's something.
Yeah. No, it's obvious. It's obvious there's a connection there.
So let's assume she goes to Nixon, who then goes to the folks he knows.
Right.
And they say, look, this woman is giving us a lot of money to get this done, and we need to do it. And so they simply, made a few. So the names that we've always heard, the mob, the Rossellis, the Hunts, all these people, do you think they were indeed players in this thing?
All right, let me explain about the mafia.
Okay.
On their own, the mafia would never have killed the President of the United States. These books, assassination books, are lying. They try to show you they're having secret conspiracies, these are mafiosos to kill the president because of Jimmy Hoffa and all this stuff.
Right, and they want back in Cuba.
The mafia
like
is a very patriotic organization. It may be a criminal organization, but they respect the government. They would never do this on their own, except when they're told to be part of this.
Told to be part of it. That's right.
That's right. They're told to participate. That's how they got involved with this. But on their own, these assassination books keep saying that.
Well,
and the mafia, they did it on their... No. They would not have done this.
And they're told to participate, Michael, by those who could make their life miserable if they refused.
Whatever the reasons, yes, whatever happened there. The Catholic Church was involved, too, unfortunately, in this. Madame Nhu went to the Pope and started... she used some ideology. I'm talking about the law. This is a law of tyrannicide. Tyrannicide.
Hold on, Michael. We're already at the top of the hour. We've got one more to go with you. We're going to take a few calls, too, but we've got so much material to cover here with you. The astrology, why you say Oswald was an FBI agent. We'll get back to all of this in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And this hour, we're with Michael Cohen. He's sharing his thoughts on who killed JFK, and we'll be back with more in your calls on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back, Michael Cohen with us. Michael, tell us the role that astrology played in this assassination.
Yeah, I thought you'd find that interesting.
I sure do.
Yeah, because you never heard this before, did you?
No, sir. Not at all.
Oh, yeah. They wouldn't put that in the assassination books. That's off limits, Okay, about 1975, a new book came out about the Kennedy assassination, written by a former agent of the CIA. It was called The Tears of Autumn by Charles McCary. He said this is a novel. It's a fictional account of the Kennedy assassination. So I said, well, there's more truth in fiction. Let me buy the book. Let's see what this guy has to say, right? And what he said was very scary. What he said was this: when the surviving relatives of Diem in South Vietnam heard about the assassination of Diem and Nhu, they wanted to kill President Kennedy. He doesn't mention Madame Nhu in this, by the way. He says surviving relatives. What they did was they went to an astrologer in Saigon, which today is Ho Chi Minh City, and they told the astrologer, this is President Kennedy's birthday. Give us a day when we could kill him, and we know it'll work out according to his astrology table.
Oh.
Yeah, you see, we don't think like that here in this country, but in Asia, they think like that. People are dying and murdered by things like this. So this got my interest on this, and I said, wait a minute here, So I started doing research on this, and the more research I did, the worse it got. This is what really happened. All the astrology magazines in the United States predicted Kennedy was in big trouble on November 22nd. They all warned him, Mr. President, be very careful. This is a very dangerous time for you to do anything. I never know the lineup of the planets, the exact thing, how it worked out. But for months in advance, he was being warned about this.
Well, I remember Gene Dixon warned.
Let me tell you, I'm getting to Gene Dixon. Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So let me just tell you about this. So all these magazines were warning him on this stuff. And, of course, after the assassination, all these magazines say, oh, look what we did. Aren't we geniuses? We predicted this was going to happen. Now, Gene Dixon gets involved in this. By the way, I don't think your audience knows about Gene Dixon. She died a number of years ago. You want to talk about her background, or should I refer some of the things about
you can, and some of the people know about her, of course.
Okay, all right. Gene Dixon was probably one of the greatest psychics or astrologers in American history, next to Edgar Cayce. From Franklin Roosevelt to Nixon, she gave advice to presidents in the White House. She claims she brought a crystal ball in, and she used to hide it because they're afraid the guards might think it was a bomb or something. And she would give psychic advice, which shows you the caliber of our presidents listening to a woman like this. She might have said during Eisenhower, we better bomb Moscow, and my crystal ball says it's bad news. But I'm just saying they were listening to her and what she had to say. In 1956, she predicted in writing that the president elected in 1960 will be assassinated. Okay. She actually said this in 1956. People in the parapsychology area said, well, it's a 20-year cycle. I don't know if your audience is familiar with the 20-year
We know that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So she was using that. That's what they said. She was using that to make that prediction. Okay. 1963 comes along, and around June or May, 4 months before Kennedy's death, she's on the Long John Neville show. You know about, well, we know about Long John Neville, right?
He was the one who started all this. Thanks to him, right. I'm here.
That's correct. That's correct. And on the show, she said President Kennedy is going to die this year. Neville, after the show, warned her to keep her mouth shut. He said, don't say things like that on the air.
That's a no-no for radio,
Right. Even then, so. But that didn't stop her, because she kept making predictions for the rest of the year, and she named November 22nd. Apparently, she was using the astrology part, not the psychic area, reading the tables there. And according to her bio, I pulled it off the internet. I don't know how true this is. She kept warning Kennedy right through that fall not to go south. Watch out for November 22nd. It's a dangerous day for you. And even on the morning of that date, she said Kennedy's going to die today. This is in her bio. I don't know how true that part is. But she was on the radio making statements like that, threatening him. Of course, she became very famous afterwards, after Kennedy died. Her reputation, blew up, and she wrote several books on it and so forth.
I remember Look magazine at the time. Look magazine, or was it Life magazine at the time, Michael, that did a feature on her after the fact?
They all did it. She became very famous. You go to any of these psychic books in the library, parapsychology, she's written up about it. What they don't tell you, though, is that the assassins use that information to kill President Kennedy. See, they don't. We think differently than they do in other parts of the world. You could take, it's very dangerous. Somebody has your birth date. If somebody wants to kill you, they could go to an astrologer. Here's your birthday. What's the best day to kill this person?
And then they do.
But not. It could happen, and it might happen. Maybe it goes on all the time. We don't know.
Who knows?
But it could be a dangerous weapon, astrology. And this is what happened with Kennedy. They used it against him, and in the end, he got killed. Now, I don't know about the stars and the planets having the effect on the assassination, or, it worked well because of that. I'm not too sure about that. But astrology was a factor. Now, why is it banned in the books? I'll tell you why it's banned in the assassination books. Because Madame Nhu was a big thing with astrology. She really believed in it. And if you start looking at astrology with the Kennedy death, it's one step to her very quickly. I'll tell you how much she believed in it. She kept her birth date secret. It was a national secret. Yeah, you're laughing about it.
She didn't want, well, that was one of those laughs where she didn't want anybody to know her birthday because they didn't want anything to happen. She didn't want anything to happen to her.
Correct. That the assassins would use that against her. If you remember, I told you if you look up Google her name, you'll see the New York Times obituary on her last year. If you stand down at the end of that obituary, there's a footnote that the New York Times gave the wrong birth date in the original obituary. The wrong date. She died at 86 or 87. And they said we couldn't find her birth date. We made a mistake. And then they said, well, we figured out it was this date instead. They got him confused because she kept that secret. She didn't want anybody to know that.
Michael, how did she avoid getting prosecuted or tied into the assassination?
Well, when you know people like Richard Nixon, Allen Dulles, maybe Chief Justice Warren, when you know the big shots, when you have billionaire friends, from Southern California and Texas who are your buddies, when you know the Pope personally, it helps. It helps. And they covered it up afterwards.
And she took it with her to the grave?
Okay, yes. Unfortunately, she took it to the grave. And I think, though, the people in our government, what I found interesting is when she died, every major newspaper last year did obituaries on her. For 47 years, they never mentioned her name in the press. It was all banned. You couldn't talk about it.
She was gone. Yeah, it's like she didn't exist.
Right. But then when she dies, you look at that New York Times obituary. It's 3 pages long. And I think what happened was this. The people in power here were so happy she died because she was a loose cannon. She could shoot her mouth off. Look what happened to Howard Hunt, his deathbed confession. Remember that?
Yeah,
She could have pulled something like that. I mean, I think they had a sigh of relief, and they said, okay, let's give her a good obituary, good riddance to her. We don't have to worry about her anymore, coming up with names or maybe appearing on your show.
Yeah.
Who knows what she was capable of doing.
I would have interviewed her.
Okay, yeah, you would have. That's the last thing they wanted. Believe me, they didn't want you to interview. That would be very dangerous for them. But they were so happy. So every major newspaper in this country, you scan down that thing, there, obituary after obituary, they all were reporting on her. Her death. But 47 years, you couldn't talk about it. You couldn't say anything about her. With that business. But that's where the astrology thing came in on that. Now, in 1982, and if you look down Madame Nhu videos. If you Google that, there was a 1982 interview with her for 1 hour, and it was very interesting. She doesn't admit she killed the president in that interview, but she says everything else. And
who interviews her? Do you know?
I'm not sure if it was from France or something. She was living in France, or I don't remember the interviewer, but she goes into a lot of interesting topics if you're into history and the Cold War. First of all, she hates America. Oh, my God. She really laces. She calls all the American presidents incompetent and stupid. This is up to 1982. She says America doesn't know what it's doing in foreign policy. We blunder from war to war to disaster, like the Berlin Wall, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And she says, America's doomed, she says. Look at the people who are running your country. She actually says this. And now you think about today. Has it changed? Did we blunder into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya? We're blundering all over the place. But she said, you got to watch that interview. It's very interesting.
Well, and what's interesting, we're going to take some calls here. Then I want to talk with you about the Oswald FBI connection.
Oh, yeah.
Ho Chi Minh, Michael, Ho Chi Minh came to us before we were even involved in Vietnam and wanted our assistance, and we turned our back on him.
That's correct.
All this could have been avoided.
Well, the communists were at that point, worried about the communists. He was a communist, and and also the French wanted us back. The Catholic Church wanted more control. Take over. Vietnam was a very rich country. had rubber plantations, minerals, and things, and
Sure.
he wanted control over that. So we brushed them aside, Ho Chi Minh.
Let's take some calls here for a while here for you. New Jersey we go, east of the Rockies.
Yeah.
Hey, Chuck, go ahead. You're on with Michael Cohen.
Yeah.
Hello, George. How are you?
Good, Chuck.
Well, listen, I have listened to the past, I would say, 9 of these specials that Coast to Coast AM has done. Okay? And I'll tell you something. First, let me just preface by saying I do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the guilty party at all. Okay? He was not the assassin. But what I'm hearing here is a real dismissal of history. Kennedy was absolutely undermined by his people on the ground in Vietnam, including Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the ambassador at the time to Vietnam. And that assassination was something that was told to him just before his Chicago trip, if you look into it. You'll find that he wasn't connected to that, first of all. Second of all, I would have to say that this is one of the wildest sort of less founded presentations I've ever heard, and I don't understand how it is this guy's saying a lot of these things.
Well, let's get him to react to that again, and then the interview. Not
I
over
think
yet.
I think the stories that the mafia was playing to hit him before the assassination of Diem, I think they're all made up. There's no proof. It's all speculation. There's no documentation that they were going to hit him in Chicago. It's just somebody saying something to somebody else, or the Godfathers or Trafficante said something to somebody. It's like meaningless. It's rumors. There's no proof of any of this stuff. I think that's all made up just to cover her. I can't believe anything they say in these assassination books at all. And my documentation comes from the New York Times, by the way. I'm quoting from you from the Times itself. It's better than any other stuff they have out there. I'm quoting article. By the way, this last article, let me just show you what she did, this woman. The last article in the New York Times in November came out on the 25th, the day before, the 24th, 2 days after Kennedy died. He wasn't even in the ground yet. Oswald was assassinated that day in the police station, and she sends a condolence message to Mrs. Kennedy, a sarcastic message. But in this message, she boasts about what happened, like she's responsible. Let me read the sentence that she had in here.
All right.
I'll show you what she said. Indeed, such a murder, where even the wounds inflicted on President Kennedy were identical to those of President Ngo Diem and my husband, and coming only 20 days after the Vietnamese tragedy. How did she know Kennedy was shot in the head 2 days after his assassination? How did she get that information? There's only one way.
Well, I'm not sure that was public at the time, was it?
Of course. So, even today they debate the issue. Even today they don't even know. You see these shows and everything. How did she know? She ordered it. And the assassins came back to her afterwards, telling her everything's taken care of. We did it.
Now pay
to make that statement like that, identical wounds. And how come these shows don't talk about that? They keep talking about the wounds and everything. How come they don't compare the wounds with Diem or Nhu? None of them touch that subject. Why not? She said they're identical. They don't touch. Why don't they touch it?
Well, and was she not, as you mentioned, but let's bring this up again, did not the Warren Commission conclude that she was a suspect?
That's correct.
And they kept it quiet, didn't they?
For 30 years it was kept quiet, and it was only accidentally released in 1993. Even after that, the assassination books never picked up on it. They ignored it. It's right there, and they refused to publish it because they're under orders not to publish. She had to be protected. She had to be crushed. History, obliterated from history. They didn't want anybody to know about her anymore. Yes, she was a suspect. You want to get into the thing with Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll wrap up the hour with phone calls for you.
I looked a lot over these books, 3,500 books. I try to read as many as I can. I try to figure out what really happened to this guy. And I came across the report of the Attorney General of the state of Texas. His name was Wagoner Carr, C-A-R-R. I don't know if you ever heard of his name before, but anyway, let me explain what happened. When Kennedy was killed, he ordered his investigators to go to Oswald's house and clean out all his documents. He wanted to get there before the FBI got there. He didn't trust the FBI. He cleaned out the documents. He says later, We had the entire file of the FBI. He was employed as an agent of the FBI. He had documents, pay vouchers, what months he worked for the FBI. It was all in there.
Amazing. Oh.
Now, okay, this is what he said. This is the Attorney General of the state of Texas talking now. So I have to accept what he's saying now. You know, you have to go somewhere, you know, believe somebody.
Oh, yeah, you have to believe somebody.
Now,
eventually.
I traced this later on, and I said, well, what happened to this file? He says he gave it over to the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission never acknowledged they got this file.
Never did.
From the FBI. But former, President Ford was on the Warren Commission, and he wrote a book about it a year later called The Portrait of an Assassin. And you have to laugh at some of the things he said in there. They discussed this problem with Oswald being an FBI agent. But they don't use that word. They say there's a rumor that he was a government agent. That's what they say. This is what Ford is writing down in his book. And they say this is a terrible situation. You know, if this is true, the American government's in big trouble. That the guy killed him was an FBI agent or any agent of the American government. So they start talking among themselves, debating, what could we do about this? How do we solve this problem? So one of the people, I think Chief Justice Earl Warren, says, well, have Hoover say he never worked for the FBI. Another guy says, but people are not going to believe that. But that's exactly what happened. Hoover did say that, and they dropped it at that. Now, J. Lee Rankin, R-A-N-K-I-N, was the attorney for the commission. He ran the whole thing. He set it up. He wrote the summary and everything. And he said, after listening to this debate going on about Oswald being an agent, government agent, he said, look, this commission has only one goal, to prove that Oswald was not a government agent, period. Not that he was innocent or guilty, whatever. That's the only goal we have in this to produce. And that's what went on for the rest of the time, trying to prove he was not a government agent. They had one piece of evidence they couldn't hush up. He was in the FBI building a week before the assassin. He wanted to see one of the agents there. He wasn't there, and he gave a letter to be given to that agent. Later, after the assassination, that agent said he didn't read the letter. He ripped it up and destroyed it. That they admitted, that he was. You might have heard that. He wasn't the FBI.
I wonder what that letter said.
Probably wanted a pay increase.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious. He was only getting $200 a week. A month, $200 a month. Of course, today's money is like $2,000 and everything.
Right.
My guess is he wanted more benefits. He had a family to support.
He wanted more.
He wanted more, yeah. And he was sacrificed, as we know. Of course, the Dallas police was totally corrupted. For 2 days, they interviewed him. They never had tapes. They never wrote down what he said. It's a mystery what happened, what he was talking to him.
Has anybody else concluded the same thing you've concluded about Madame Nhu?
Nobody.
You're out there all by yourself.
Matter of fact, if you go look at Amazon.com, Madame Nhu, read down. The only books on her is about the Vietnam thing. No, they will not publish.
All right, well, stay with us. We're going to come back, and we're going to take some phone calls, final calls with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, we're going to take some final phone calls with Michael Cohen here in his theory. Before next hour, we bring in a special theory on destiny betrayed, so get ready for that. Hey, you have an opportunity to sound off. That's right. Coast to Coast listeners can sound off about things that they feel and deem important. Simply write your editorial to editorial@coasttocoastam.com. Include your phone number. Producer Tom will look it over, get back to you, and maybe record you just like this.
Hi, this is Susan from Canada. This is my sound off. Thousands of scientists have been studying the universe for over 50 years with all kinds of high-end satellite technical equipment. And you mean to tell me that they only knew now how to discover planets in front of stars? What a load of malarkey. You can't honestly believe it has only been recently that they've discovered this. I would more likely believe this was discovered in the 1960s. It really doesn't take a genius to think of this kind of strategy or equipment to find planets. Wow, they really must think we're stupid. I think they put TV in front of the populace to keep us sleeping. How evident. Well, the sleeping giant's awake. People need to start asking questions and stop the insanity. This is Susan from Canada, and this has been my sound off.
And welcome back to Coast. We're with Michael Cohen. Let's go to the phones. Patrick in Louisiana. Hey, Patrick, go ahead.
Hi, George. Hi, Mr. Cohen.
How you doing?
George, my question is,
as Mr. Cohen, you're researching all this, how do you coordinate, how do you weigh all these possible facts that you say are facts in line with what other conspirators say, and not just that, but with timelines? I mean, 20 days is a pretty short amount of time to get a hold of somebody like Richard Nixon and the Pope. And gee, I sure hope we have a patsy already set up and a job in a school book depository so that we can use this as an assassination. And I'm glad, George, your first caller was somebody who said he believed that Oswald was an absolute, patsy, and out of it, because the more research I do, and the more time that I've spent with it, I tend to believe that Oswald at least made the decision to act by himself. I certainly, after hearing this, I have a hard time believing somebody who was an FBI agent would then shoot a Dallas policeman, would be in perfect coordination for something like this to happen with such a little bit of time to be put in.
What about the time, Michael? You're breaking up a little bit here, Patrick. What the time span was fast, wasn't it?
Well, 20 days, yes. That's why it's one of the most incredible things that happened in American history. A massive conspiracy like this set up so quickly, so accurately, and everything worked right to the end. I find it interesting. I go to these websites where they have Kennedy assassination debates and things that go on with this. And all these websites, they admit that she was involved in the assassination. They don't deny it, but they put her down as a woman. They said she could not have done this in 20 days. They say that, but they don't give any reasons. I did the research on this. I could see what happened. Her connection to Richard Nixon opens up the whole thing immediately. That's the way she pulled it off. He was the conduit. That's what was missing in all the other books. You understand?
Yeah, and it is missing in all the other books.
Oh, they were not because they cannot quote. Then these writers are not allowed to quote Madame Nhu and what happened with Richard Nixon. She's off limits. It's banned. Let me tell you how bad it is with the censorship in books. All right, if you go to the public library, which I did, and you look at history of the Vietnam War, 1,000 books on the subject. Pull a few off the shelves. Her name appears in every single book because she was there at the early stages of the war. But what they've done is they censored those books because they all end on November 1st. It says November 1st, Nhu is assassinated, Diem's assassinated, and she's out of power. None of them go on to the next day and says that she blames President Kennedy for the deaths and she was going to get President Kennedy. They stop right there. Every single book stops at November 1st. They will not go to November 2nd. That's how complete the censorship is with her, how they can censor 1,000 history books like that.
Let's go to Chicago. Lisa's with us. Hi, Lisa. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? I'm so excited to be talking to you. Happy Thanksgiving to you. I've been listening to you for a million years, and I'm just so excited to be talking to you because I'm a teacher and I'm up every morning at 5:40 in the morning. But I wanted to ask you about Jack Ruby. Do you think he was involved at all with the Chicago Mafia in the assassination?
That's a good question, Michael.
I was going to speak about the role of the Jews and Israel in the assassination because it took enough time, but I could give a whole thing about that. He was a dual agent. He was a mafioso. There's no doubt about it. He was in charge of the strip club, the Carousel Club in Dallas. His job was to get control of the police officers by bribing them with liquor and prostitutes and everything. He was mafia, but he was Jewish too. And he also was involved with Israel. And there is speculation out there that the Jews were involved in this assassination. There's a website. If you look at Kennedy Assassination Israel, you could pull up a lot of interesting articles. I don't know how true they are. Some of the things they say are pretty frightening. But the two most important people who cleaned up this mess afterwards were Jews. You had Ruby, who was Jewish, who assassinated Oswald, and then you had former Senator Arlen Specter involved in the Warren Commission. And Specter came up with the magic bullet theory. Remember that whole business with that? Mm-hmm, with the pristine bullet? In other words, they had to prove that Oswald only fired 3 shots. But the wounds indicated a lot more than several bullets hit these people. So Specter had to come up with a crazy story that one bullet went through Kennedy, then moved left, right, up and down, backwards, forwards, then it went into Connally, went in different directions, came out and was pristine. So you have two Jews who are key in covering up this. I'm not happy about this. I'm Jewish. I'm not happy about this. That these two people, now they go more involved. In some of these websites, they're saying they're working for the Mossad, these people. They were on the orders of the Israeli government to do this. And the reason was that the Israeli government was angry because Kennedy was trying to shut down a nuclear reactor they built in the desert there, producing nuclear weapons. Kennedy was very angry at the Israelis with this business.
But you don't believe that part of the theory, do you?
That part, I'm just telling you what they say. There is truth that before he died, he had a big problem with Israel and nuclear weapons. That's a fact. That this nuclear reactor, what happened was Kennedy was sending American inspectors over there to see what was going on with the reactor, and the Israelis wouldn't let him into the reactor.
You mean like we're trying to do with Iran right now?
Right. So he wrote a threatening letter to the Israeli prime minister about it. I read the letter there, saying, you better let those people in, and we want them in every 6 months to go into that reactor. You have to see the whole reactor, not part of it. So there was a conflict going on between Kennedy and him, but what these assassination people talk about, as writers say on the site, is they didn't play the major role. They were minor role. The Mossad played a minor role. And these two characters, Ruby and Spectre, were the cleanup squad. That was their job. They weren't the assassins, you see? That's the way I look at Ruby.
Well, I'll always believe Ruby was sent to muffle Oswald or do something.
No doubt about it. There's no doubt about it he was sent to do it, and he had no problem doing it because he controlled the Dallas Police Department. They were all corrupted from his club. And you notice what happened, how he walked up to Oswald, the police all moved away. Remember the pictures of that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was like they knew it. Here he comes.
Here he comes with his gun in his hand, and they made a corridor for him so he could get to Oswald and shoot him to death, you know? So, of course, it was all corrupted, the business. Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment, which I consider to be the only decent book out there on the Kennedy assassination. Mark Lane was the lawyer who represented Oswald's wife at the hearings, the Warren Commission hearings. And he wrote this book, Rush to Judgment, and he attacked the Warren Commission from a legal point of view. And he showed how they lied again and again and again, you know, and everything they claimed. And one of the things they lied about was Ruby's position there. They tried to say he wasn't mafia. They tried to say he had an innocent strip club. That's all he was doing there. And they said, he only entertained 10 policemen there. And their evidence was hundreds of policemen would go into that club to get free liquor, to get prostitutes. And when Lane shows how they were lying on the Warren Commission, trying to play it down, this guy was not a mafia godfather there.
Was Madame Nhu hated in Vietnam by her own people?
By the Buddhists?
By the Buddhists.
Yeah, 90% of the population hated. Oh, sure, they hated her. Oh, yeah, she killed them. She tortured them.
When did she flee Vietnam to live elsewhere?
Okay, it was beginning of October 1963. This is where she began the tour of America, and she was here when the assassination of her husband.
So she never went back.
Never went back in her life. She would actually, if you look at it from the point of view, she was like an orphan here. She was isolated. Her husband was just killed. She could never go back home. She's stuck here. And by the way, there's a video of her. If you look at that video, I told you about. There's several videos where she's at the airport in Los Angeles, and the reporters give her the bad news about the coup. And she's sitting there with her daughter and the sunglasses, and she said the gates of hell have opened up, and that Kennedy was responsible, started carrying on there and threatening. And then a reporter says, would you want to live here in America? He says, are you out of your mind to live in this country like this? Or she announced it. And then later on, she did the big news conference I told you about. But there's a video of her being told about this, what would happen there.
Where did she end up? Where was she when she died? In the United States?
I believe it was in Rome. I think it was in Rome. She lived in Rome and France, mostly in Rome. She was Catholic. She was involved with the church, very heavily involved. She knew the Pope. She was involved with all these people there, and very religious woman, very religious. But as her father said, she was insane. A Buddhist, killing Buddhists. It's like a Jew working for Hitler or something. The same type of analogy with her.
Michael, one of the most tumultuous times in the history of this country, I think.
No doubt about it. We never recovered from that.
No,
we never recovered from it.
Let's go to Clint, Anchorage, Alaska. You're on with us. Go ahead, Clint.
Hi, George. Thanks for taking my call, and I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving out there.
Well, thank you.
Michael, I have a question about Ted or Kennedy's dad. Didn't it start back in
Joseph?
And he ran for president?
The father, Kennedy's father?
Yes.
No, he didn't run because he was corrupted and everything. He never did that. He wasn't. He had too many problems, so he never ran for the presidency. He groomed his sons to run. His older brother Jack, who died in the war, and then John, and then the others. They were groomed. He could never run. He might have wanted to, but he couldn't.
Did he try to get involved? He tried to get involved in politics, though, wasn't he, Michael?
He was involved, but he was corrupt with the mafia, with the Irish mafia, with the with the bootlegging and all that nonsense.
That's where he made his money, right?
Oh yeah, that's where the money was made. Of course, the family money was based on that. I think the family still is involved with the whiskey imports or something. They have a concession on that with the liquor. But he never got that. No, he could never. I know he said he talked about it, but he had too much on it, too many bad things going for him. So he realized he had to groom his sons to do that, to take over.
All right.
By the way, one thing I want to say in that book, The Tears of Autumn, McCary does say that he quotes the Vietnamese saying, "We killed Kennedy, but we have to kill one more Kennedy brother to make it even because Diem and Nhu were killed." He actually said, that's what the Vietnamese were telling him. We got to kill one more, and you know who the other one was?
Was Robert.
That's right.
When did that book come out, Tears of Autumn?
Mid-'70s, about 75, 76. I heard him on radio talking about it, and he said, well, don't believe what I have in the book. It's all fiction, he says.
Yeah.
So I said, well, it's all, the only book out of thousands that is fiction has to be true, because the other books are all fiction.
Let's go to Bruce, Louisville, Kentucky. Hey, Bruce, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call, gentlemen. Very interesting show tonight. I have a question. I had heard rumors that Jacqueline Kennedy, after her death, that there was an envelope she left that was sealed and was not to be opened until 25 years after the death of her children. Have you ever come across anything like that?
I heard some speculation, nothing definite. There were tapes she had, though, where she said about the assassination. She made some remarks about some tapes afterwards. I didn't hear the tapes where she said it was a program, there was a conspiracy or something like that. I think what happened was this with Jackie Kennedy. It's my opinion. The church made her shut up about the whole thing. They made her quiet about it because, see, when Kennedy had Diem killed and Nhu killed, they were very important people in the Catholic Church. And to the church, that's a terrible thing that happened, that Kennedy was involved in those assassinations. And I think they had a talk with her about it. And they said, look, you got to keep your mouth shut. Your husband did a terrible thing by killing those two. And he was killed, but that's vengeance. That's the way it works. That's what I think happened. And that's why she never talked about the assassination or everything else that went on. That's only my opinion about it. Somebody got to her and shut her up. And I think it was the church that did it.
Why did Johnson escalate the war after he became president?
Well, you understand, the war, Johnson called it a limited war. What's a limited war? We weren't going to win the war. We weren't able to do what was necessary to win. What was necessary to win? Well, you had to cut off the supplies from China and Russia. You had to attack the Russian ships bringing supplies in constantly. We couldn't do that. So we were fighting the war with our hands behind our backs, one hand behind our back, trying to win something when the supplies and the weapons and the manpower kept coming in, and we were being overwhelmed. China admitted years afterwards they had 300,000 soldiers fighting in that war. We didn't know that at the time. They boasted about that they were involved. We didn't know we were fighting Chinese soldiers. We couldn't tell the difference who were fighting on that. So we were overwhelmed. We couldn't bomb the necessary targets. We couldn't stop the port of Haiphong and stop the ships from coming in. It was a losing cause. Our hands were tied. We couldn't tack this thing or couldn't tack that. It wasn't like World War II where we won that war. We couldn't do a lot of things. That's the reason we lost it. And we weren't designed to win the war.
We didn't.
A limited war is not a real war.
No, we did not give our troops the backing we needed to win that war. And
That's
we should
right.
have been.
But that was designed for that. It was deliberately done like that.
And we should never have been there in the first place.
Sure, of course, we agree. But we got pulled into it. Kennedy pulled us into that. He's the one that set up this whole mess.
Eisenhower was there first, right?
Okay, let me tell you what happened. Kennedy was running for president. in 1960, and he had a big problem because the Protestants hated him being a Catholic. And they said, if you become president, you'll take orders from the Pope. So he had he had an audience of Protestant ministers, and he started telling them, look, I will not take orders from the Pope. I'll be an independent person. So everybody, they believed him. They voted for him. But Kennedy was lying at the time, because as soon as he got into office, the Vatican told him, you got to send troops to Vietnam because that Catholic government's in trouble. He took orders all the way for the next 3 years until he had the fights with Nhu and the whole business with them. Then he broke with the Vatican. But he was under the control of the Vatican. The person in charge was Cardinal Spellman, Spellman. He was the cardinal from New York. He was giving advice to all these presidents, from Eisenhower all the way on up, about the war. He was taking orders from the Vatican. Now, nobody wants to talk about this in the history books. So they say, he never took orders from the Vatican. That's not true. He was taking orders to save the Catholic government there in South Vietnam. And he was the one that escalated this business and got us involved in this. By the time he died, it was too late. We had 30,000 soldiers fighting and dying every day. It was too late to do anything.
Let's go to Alex, Los Angeles, California. Hey, Alex, go ahead.
Hi, George. How are you? Thank you very much for taking my call, and have a happy Thanksgiving.
You too, Alex. Only got about a minute, so go ahead.
Okay. I'm the writer of a play called The Magic Bullet Theory, which my co-writer and I predicated on the theory that the powers that be set up the hit on the president to miss him, not hit him, and it went completely awry. And I was kind of wondering if that could fall into the pantheon of other kind of theories that would be out there.
Well, what do you mean they wanted to miss him? I mean, they had assassins there trying to miss him? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, the idea was to set it up to make it look like it was an assassination hit. They miss him, everybody else is expendable, and then they can give him evidence that Castro ordered the hit, and they could get Cuba back.
Did you read this in one of these assassination books? Did you get this from one?
No. Actually, I blame myself for this one.
All right. You see, they make up a lot of things about this business. When you have an assassin assigned to target, they're not going to play games. No, they were out to kill him.
There's no doubt.
Really does not hold any water.
And as you know, Michael, there are probably more people there, grassy knoll, everything else. Michael, thank you for the theory. And we've got more coming. So stick with us. We'll continue in a moment. Destiny Betrayed. James DiEugeno is next with us on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to our John F. Kennedy Assassination special, and still another theory, Destiny Betrayed. And we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. 20 years ago, James DiEugeno wrote Destiny Betrayed. And now he has updated it, and we'll bring him on the show now. James, how are you?
Good evening, George.
Good to have you with us. So you updated Destiny Betrayed. Tell me why.
Well, I really wouldn't use the word updated. I would say it's been more or less 90% rewritten. Okay, and
that's pretty complete then. Okay.
Yeah. It's essentially, for all intents and purposes, it's another book. Why did I do it? Because I had learned so much more about this case and about the presidency of John F. Kennedy, and particularly using the declassified files of the Assassination Record and Review Board, especially how they applied to the investigation of Jim Garrison. I just felt that, the book I wrote today is pretty much a night and day version because, maybe I should tell your listeners if they don't know. The ARB is the Assassination Record and Review Board that was set up in 1994 after Oliver Stone's film JFK created such a swirl of controversy about all the files that had not yet been declassified on the John F. Kennedy case.
Okay.
So therefore, a 5-person board went to work with a staff of about 25 people, and they went to work for about 4 years trying to declassify as many of these files as they could. And they came up with about 2 million pages. all right, and added to the previous 2 million pages, this creates about 4 million pages on the John F. Kennedy case in National Archives. They actually had to create a whole different location to accommodate all these new files. So a lot of these, a surprising amount, were on the Jim Garrison case. And so since that was the focus of the first version of the book, I went ahead and took a look at this stuff, and I decided, well, this warrants a new look because we know so much more about what really happened to Garrison as a result of this. And combined with the stuff I had learned about the John F. Kennedy case, plus rather the presidency of Kennedy, plus Lee Harvey Oswald, I decided that the time was ripe for completely redoing the book, and so that's essentially why I did it.
Over the years, you probably have heard as many theories as I have, James, about the Kennedy assassination. Why are there so many? I mean, I just had one right before you came on. It's almost as if every researcher has their own view over what happened.
Well, George, my book doesn't deal with theories. Okay, I have over 2,000 footnotes in the book.
Yeah, I know.
All right?
It's very comprehensive.
And almost all of this that in my book is absolutely verifiable. And the way I feel about this case today is if you don't base a large part of your book on these new files, then it essentially is a theory. Okay? So that's something that I really did try and avoid. Okay? So, in this particular case, because most of these secret files were stowed away for so many years, because they didn't start being declassified till 1994, for about 30 years, you had stuff that really wasn't based on anything, and it was essentially based upon, well, let's take a look. You had the Warren Commission report in the 26 volumes. You had the Church Committee report, all right, which really wasn't all that long. It was only about 60 or 70 pages. And you had the volumes of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Well, for instance, the House Select Committee report on assassinations, we know now, was essentially a censored piece of work because the best stuff the House Select Committee did, Robert Blakey, who was the chief counsel of that body, classified most of the great stuff. For example, the Mexico City report done by Eddie Lopez and Dan Hardway, which is an incredible piece of work. So that's just one instance. About the Warren report, I think we can say today with pretty much authority, that report is pretty much in all of its conclusions is useless. There is some good information, but most of the stuff in the Warren Commission report that was of any value was also not declassified until years later.
That's right.
So in one way, I guess you can say the import of the JFK case is how much the government had to keep secret and therefore allowed these theories, I mean, there must be a dozen of them, okay, to run rampant in the meantime. And I really do believe, George, between me, you, and your audience, that was their intent. See, in my book, after Garrison, after the subterfuge of Garrison and the CIA's effort to make sure that Clay Shaw would be acquitted, after that succeeded, all right, what happened was that there was a document, well, not really a document, a manuscript that was published, okay, right after Garrison's case failed. All right, this was called the Torbett document. The proper title is Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. It's very mysterious where this thing came from. All right, supposedly, two FBI guys or Secret Service guys visited a lawyer in Texas And he put together this essay, this rather long essay, in which everybody and your Aunt Mary is involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
God. Everyone's
and I'm exaggerating only slightly. I mean, you name it, NASA, the Defense Intelligence Security Command, okay, the FBI, military intelligence, the mafia, everything is in there in this giant Rube Goldberg contraption, okay? Everybody except one exception, Garrison's prime suspect, the CIA.
The CIA.
Okay? And I think that was notable by its absence. I think that this, in my book, I actually write that in my belief, this was a deliberate misdirection play by the powers that be to essentially make the research community get lost in the woods with all these different crazy theories. And this, of course, was a harbinger of what was to come. Because now you were going to get all these, my God, dozens of theories about who and why Kennedy was killed. All right? And
they played it perfectly.
I didn't listen to your previous speaker. Okay? Was this supposed to be Madame Nhu killed Kennedy?
Yes, that was his theory.
Oh, I don't understand that at all. So I can't really comment on it. You know, was the idea that somehow Kennedy was responsible for the death of Diem and his brother?
Yeah, exactly. And she was ticked off.
That's not true. See, that's based on, you know, I could talk about that subject for a long time.
See, I had always heard, James, that Kennedy was upset that Diem was assassinated and felt that the CIA was running rogue on him.
Yes, and that if you take a look at Jim Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable, he has the best rendition of what actually happened to Diem and his brother. Okay, it was not. In fact, Kennedy actually. Let me try and get rid of this in a very brief nutshell. See, there was a part of Kennedy's cabinet that did want to get rid of Diem and his brother. They waited for precisely the right weekend when almost everybody was out of town
to do it,
including JFK, you know, to send this cable, okay, over to Saigon, all right? And they misled Kennedy about who would approve the cable, all right? Now, this Henry Cabot Lodge had just gone over to Saigon. And by the way, Lodge was not Kennedy's choice to be the ambassador. Okay, he wanted to appoint a guy named Edmund Gillian, who would have done a much better job than Lodge. But Dean Rusk vetoed that choice, the Secretary of State. Lodge was part of the conspiracy to go ahead and get the cable and go ahead and enact the cable and show it to the military guys who wanted to overthrow Diem.
What did the cable say?
What?
What did the cable say?
It was essentially, if Diem does not change his ways, okay, then it's time to go ahead and encourage a new government.
Okay.
That was essentially what the cable said. Okay? But what happened is that Lodge did not do the first thing in the cable, which was he was supposed to show it to Diem. He never showed it to Diem. Okay? He went right to the military guys. All right? So when Kennedy gets back, all right, and he sees what has happened, he's furious. He's basically, you know, saying, you know, this kind of crap has got to stop. You know, one of the guys who was involved in the plot to get the cable over there, Mike Forrestal, volunteered to resign, and Kennedy said, you know, you're not worth firing. You guys owe me something now. So Kennedy then tried to cancel the cable. And there's actually an interview with Lodge on that PBS show, Vietnam and Television History, in which he says, you know, Kennedy sent a cancellation cable over. Well, the cancellation didn't work because it had all, you know, once you start something like this, it's almost impossible to stop it unless you go there yourself and do it. And with Lodge and Cohen on, you know, over there in Saigon, they secretly encouraged the coup. All right? Okay, but they even went beyond that. Cohen, by cooperating with the guys who wanted to take over, ensured that Diem would not be allowed safe exit out of the country. Because Diem made a dumb mistake and stayed in contact with Lodge as he was trying to escape, not knowing that Lodge and Cohen were in cahoots with these military guys. So therefore, wherever Diem went, he would call Lodge. Lodge would tell Cohen where he was, and these military guys would then follow him. All right? Yeah. So that's what happened. Okay, and that's what ended up with the death of Diem. It wasn't on Kennedy. It was between Lodge and Cohen. All right, and Kennedy was very upset when he heard about this. All right, and he actually called Lodge back to Washington for the express purpose of firing them. And right before this, he had told Forrestal, we're going to get to the bottom of how that cable was sent. All right? But unfortunately, when he calls back Lodge, for the purposes of firing, he's assassinated in Dallas. Therefore, Johnson is a new president. And what, of course, happens then is that, Johnson essentially tells Lodge that you're going to stay there, and we're going to go ahead and escalate this war. Which was the opposite thing of what Kennedy was going to do. All right, so that's that in a nutshell. If you want the whole story, JFK and the Unspeakable is probably the best source for that.
Let's get into some of the things that you've documented here in your work, Destiny Betrayed, and what was it that was so dramatic that had you really rewrite the thing?
Well, there were there was more than one thing. One of the really interesting things that I discovered is the whole size and scope of the effort to derail Jim Garrison. And this began in late 1966, and Alan Dulles was actually involved himself, with this personally, because he hires an electronics wizard by the name of Gordon Novell for the express purpose of wiring Garrison's office for sound, okay? Because what's going to happen is the beginning of a counterintelligence program, and the only way you can do that is if you have to know what's going on inside the opposition's camp, okay? And
sounds like
that was just the beginning. This effort would then go on, for all the way up to and beyond the trial of Clay Shaw. I've outlined in the book approximately 4 phases of this effort, and it goes on all the way to the trial, during Shaw's trial, and one of the most alarming things is when Richard Helms commissioned something called the Garrison Group, which was the actual task force inside the CIA, which was meant to design a counterintelligence program and task forces to counter Garrison. We know of 4 meetings of this group. There had to have been more. He actually said, your job is to design programs to counter Garrison before, during, and after the trial of Clay Shaw. And it wasn't until I really explored this in depth that I understood what Helms meant when he said after the trial of Clay Shaw. Because what the CIA was determined to do was actually 2 things. They were going to make sure that, number one, no prosecution ever again came out of New Orleans in the Kennedy case. And number 2, they were going to make an example of Garrison, okay, to everybody else, to show what would happen if anybody really did try and bring another case in the Kennedy assassination.
What was Garrison's motivation? What got him going into this in the first place, Jim?
Oh, well, Garrison had, I think you know this, Garrison had first questioned David Ferrie back in 1963. All right. He made a mistake and turned him over to the FBI. The FBI essentially gave Ferrie a rubber stamp. Ferrie told him a whole bunch of lies, which if Hoover was really interested, he could have seen through all those lies. See, I actually discuss Ferry's FBI report, okay, in the book. And I show that because of all the BS that Ferry dumped out in this report, he should have been arrested. Because not only was he
had
lying,
a file. Didn't he have a file on all this and everything else?
The FBI?
Ferry. Didn't he have his own file on what looked like an assassination plot?
Oh yes, right. You did you read the book?
Of course.
Oh, okay? I didn't think you read it that fast. Okay.
Oh yeah, I got to the good stuff real fast.
Oh, okay, all right. There was a file that called The Bomb, okay, in which Ferry actually had these. Well, it's very hard to describe. One of them looked like an assassination attempt on Castro. It was drawn out like in a picture. Mm-hmm. The other one, the woman who saw it, said it looked like a diagram of Dealey Plaza.
Yeah.
With a tall building and an open car.
And it even had streaks of bullets like going through the back of somebody and things like
that. Right. And so that part of the book I actually title, did Ferry and Shaw plan a murder? Okay. Well, anyway, back.
Hold on for 1 second, James. We're gonna take this break. Let's come right back and get into this. We'll be back. If you go to our Twitter feed at coasttocoastam.com, upper right-hand corner, you can track us with, of course, our hashtag, Who Killed JFK, and then Webmaster Lex will be putting in some of your responses on our feed as well. So go ahead and do that if you would. Hashtag, Who Killed JFK. We're into that new technology, aren't we? Back in a moment as we continue talking about Destiny Betrayed right here on Coast to Coast AM. Well, with James DiEugenio, we're talking about his work, Destiny Betrayed. James, we were talking about Garrison and what his motivation was for getting involved in all of this. Because as he knew, it was a death warrant for his career, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, he actually did say that. He said that in an interview. He said, I was perfectly aware that when I reopened the Kennedy case, my career, was about to go, very possibly be the death warrant to my political career. And I'm really glad you read the book already, George, because one of the things they try and go into is that here is a guy, if he would have stayed out of the Kennedy case, could very easily have been the senator from Louisiana.
No
because
doubt.
As it relates
no
to the
doubt.
story, he was responsible for Governor McKeithen becoming governor. And then McKeithen invited him to run in 1968 as his lieutenant governor. And McKeithen ran unopposed that year. And I described this incredible story that Bill Alford, the assistant DA, told me about. Alford walks into Garrison's office. Garrison's on one phone, and Alfred sees that the cord from the other phone's in the trash can, but he hears his voice coming out of the trash can. So he asks Garrison, who's on the other phone? He goes, it's McKeithen. He wants me to run with him for lieutenant governor. I can't be bothered with this penny-ante political crap when I'm investigating the Kennedy case.
I love it.
So here's a guy who puts the governor of the state in the garbage can because he wants to work on the JFK case and basically chuck his career, down the sword.
Where did they get the money in that district to chase down these leads?
Oh, well, Garrison had this whole fines and fees thing that he had set up. One of the things I do in the book is I try and show how bad the DA's office was until Garrison took it over, okay? And he had worked out, this whole fines and fees fund that whenever you were, fined for a crime, or had to pay some kind of a fee, it would go into this trust fund in which Garrison would then get it with the judge's approval. Now, what happened to Garrison, though, in this particular case, is that it created such a controversy in New Orleans that a bunch of wealthy people formed this group called Truth and Consequences to take the heat off of using this fund to investigate the Kennedy case. All right, but the problem is that Truth and Consequences didn't last very long. So what Garrison actually had to do was every once in a while he would have to go ahead and hit the trail to do these talks throughout the country to raise money, to finance his investigation. Okay, that's how bad it got for him, near the end, late 1968 or early 1969.
He was obsessed with this case. How close do you think he got?
Well, there's no doubt that Garrison was very obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. In my book, what I try and say in my book, after doing this in-depth investigation, exactly trying to find out where Garrison was, I come to the conclusion that Garrison was one step below the middle level of the conspiracy. Okay? In my book, I outline the ground level of the plot, which I see as George de Mohrenschildt in Dallas, Ferry, Shaw, and Bannister in New Orleans, and Ruth and Michael Payne back in Dallas, all right? I see as the next level of the plot, upward, David Phillips and Howard Hunt. And in the book, I try and show how close Garrison was to that level of the plot. Mm-hmm. Because I describe a scene in which Phillips, a man that very much resembles Phillips, actually was in New Orleans talking to Guy Bannister and Sergio Arcacha Smith about this drive to raise money for the Cuban exiles. And if you read the book, as you have, you know what a suspect I think Sergio Arcacha Smith was, rather ignored subject in the Kennedy assassination. And Howard Hunt, of course, was the guy responsible for constructing the CRC, the Cuban Revolutionary Council, of which Sergio Arcacha Smith was for a time the lead member in New Orleans. And then I go ahead and cross over this to Dallas, in which I describe that conversation that David Phillips had with his brother towards the end of his life, where his brother, who always suspected that David Phillips was involved in the Kennedy assassination, mm-hmm. he asked him, were you in Dallas the day JFK was killed? And Phillips pauses, says yes, and he starts weeping, and his brother James hangs up on him. Okay?
Wow.
And then, of course, we have the extraordinary tale of Howard Hunt, who couldn't explain exactly where he was on the day of the Kennedy assassination. And
we all know exactly where we all were.
Well, almost everybody does, yes.
Yeah.
I'd say 99.999, remember where they were. And then James Angleton puts together this memo that we must devise a excuse, an alibi for Howard Hunt because he was in Dallas, on the day that JFK was killed. So I think Garrison was like one step below the middle level of the conspiracy.
But he was
throughout
so
the
close.
book, I try and construct what the roles of Hunt and Phillips were. And as you know, I start off with Hunt because Hunt was Dulles' assistant after the Bay of Pigs, went in the tank. And Kennedy began to understand how Allen Dulles had duped him on the Bay of Pigs, that he never really expected the thing to succeed. And he thought that Kennedy would cave and send in the Navy to bail out the operation. Well, Kennedy did not cave, and instead he accepted defeat. And then he did something that Eisenhower would have never done. He actually began to investigate what happened. Okay? And as he began to investigate it, he came to the conclusion that there really never was any hope of this thing succeeding, and that Dulles tried to snooker him into committing American forces. So then the writing was on the wall that JFK was going to fire Allen Dulles, which he did. And so Dulles and Hunt hit back with this article I described in Fortune magazine, in which, knowing that Dulles was going to be fired, Dulles and Hunt got this story out, this cover story, and tried to blame the thing on JFK. And so this began the myth of the so-called D-Day airstrikes.
That's right.
Now, in case your listeners don't know what I'm talking about, there's always been this idea that somehow if Kennedy would not have cut back on the airstrikes that were to occur the morning of the actual invasion, that the invasion would have succeeded. Well, this is malarkey as it stands, because as Lyman Kirkpatrick explained in the CIA's Inspector General report, even if those airstrikes would have been launched, the Cuban exile forces were outnumbered by a factor of 100 to 1. And on top of that, there was all kinds of Soviet artillery and tanks that Castro was able to get to the front within 10 hours. But as I show in my chapter, these D-Day airstrikes were never part of the original plan. The CIA came back to Kennedy and asked him for it at the last minute. So there was never really any D-Day airstrike as part of the plan that Kennedy had approved. And Kennedy said that. I have that quote. He says, I never signed on to this. Okay.
Was it a setup from the get-go, James?
Yes, that's what I firmly believe. I firmly believe that this was all a setup by Dulles and Bissell to get Kennedy to commit to a plan that he never wanted to commit to. Okay? And further, as you read, it was an either-or for Dulles, because if the plan had succeeded, in other words, if Kennedy had sent in a Navy, all right, and the invasion had been a success, the CIA had infiltrated the operation with something called Operation 40. Operation 40 was an assassination team that was meant to eliminate, okay, not just the communists already on the island, but the more liberal parts of the Bay of Pigs force, which Kennedy had forced Howard Hunt to integrate into that 1,500-man army, specifically the socialist Manuel Rey, who Hunt despised. All right? And by the way, in the documentation on this is really kind of strong now, from about 3 or 4 very reputable sources, that Operation 40 really did exist. Okay, I asked John Newman about this, who was at one time preparing a book called Kennedy in Cuba. All right, and I asked him, I said, did this Operation 40 thing really exist? It really seems kind of far out. And he said, oh, yeah, Jim, it really did exist. They were going to polish off, all the leftist elements within the Bay of Pigs invasion. So in other words...
All at one time, right?
What?
All at one time they're going to wipe them out.
Yeah, right. Once the invasion was successful and they went into Havana, they were going to get rid of these guys. And so, of course, then, Hunt's guy, his favorite, Manuel Ertime, a very conservative guy, who many people thought was essentially another Batista, would have then become the ruler of this liberated Cuba. Okay? So this is how treacherous Dulles was with this operation. Okay? He not only lied to JFK about the possibility of success, he was also going to bamboozle him about who was going to take over Cuba if it did succeed. In other words, if Kennedy caved and did send in the Navy. And this, I put this in near the beginning of the book because this is what I mark as the beginning of this whole bitter feud between JFK and Allen Dulles. But not just that, it's who Dulles represented and what JFK really believed. Because if you read the beginning of the book, what I tried to do was show how Kennedy's foreign policy was a complete break from what had existed up to that time, from the beginning of the national security state after World War II up until Kennedy's election. Yeah. And two guys very much responsible for that, of course, were Allen Dulles and his brother, John Foster Dulles, who essentially ran foreign policy under Eisenhower, one at the CIA and one at the Department of State. And I traced their careers back to Sullivan and Cromwell, the giant law firm in New York City, which essentially served the upper classes, the huge corporations of the United States, both here and abroad. And when Dulles became CIA director, he served those interests as CIA director, and I talk about some of the coups, successful and unsuccessful, that Allen Dulles did. For example, the one in Guatemala, the one in Iran, the attempt to overthrow Sukarno in 1957 in Indonesia, and the long, dragged-out attempt to get rid of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. And what I did there is I showed how Kennedy's foreign policy was really opposed to this because Kennedy was an anti-colonialist. You know, he did not want this imperialism in these developing areas of the Third World. And he began this at a very early stage of his career back in 1951. And so this culminates in the whole Bay of Pigs disaster. Okay?
At what point, Jim, did they say Kennedy's got to go?
Well,
almost since he was elected.
In my opinion, the plot to get rid of JFK really goes into effect in 1963. Okay, but I think, in my opinion, now here I want to be clear. This is something I don't know for sure, and I'm only speculating on this, but it's informed speculation. You know, I believe that when Kennedy created that back channel to Castro, which is the beginning of 1963, you know, when he's essentially calling off Mongoose, which he did after the missile crisis, you know, and was now beginning to cut off all the monthly stipends to these Cuban exile groups that the CIA had financed since 1960, you know, one by one, and then was cutting back Mongoose till by the summer of 1963, there really was no Mongoose. There was almost no operations against Castro at all. As Desmond Fitzgerald wrote to Lyndon Johnson, you know, the whole second half of 1963, there were only 5 raids into Cuba. I believe that when they found that the CIA monitored that back channel that Kennedy had with Castro, and it was really heading into high gear in the summer of 1963, and beginning a normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States.
Yeah,
I believe that plus that and the combination that Kennedy was now really going to get out of Vietnam, I think those two things in early 1963, the writing's on the wall, and I think that that's when the plans to get rid of Kennedy go into effect.
These must have been treacherous people at the time.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, did you get to the part of the book where I describe Allen Dulles' meeting with Harry Truman?
Yes, that came, and Dulles was a name I heard when I was 15 years old. How would I have heard? How would I have heard his name at that time? Tied into the assassination at 15.
Well,
which would have been in 65.
He was such a great cover-up guy in the Warren Commission.
Yeah, it would have been in 65. His name was starting to float, and I was hearing that.
Yeah, see, in the book, I describe both his actions as I feel as part of the plot and as part of the cover-up. See, Dulles was the only member of the Warren Commission who didn't have a job at that time. Therefore, he could devote his full efforts to the Warren Commission.
Right.
And therefore, as people have deduced by examining the hearings and the attendance, Dulles was the single most active member of the Warren Commission. He was number one, Gerald Ford was number two, and John McCloy was number three. Those are the three most active members of the Warren Commission. They essentially, for all intents and purposes, to put it in a nutshell, they controlled the Warren Commission.
They did. And they're the
all
ones that came up with the theories and everything else. They literally steered the Warren Commission into talking about Oswald as the lone gunman.
Yes. Yes. And this meeting that we briefly noted here, okay, I think is really startling.
All right, let's talk about that when we come back, James. Plus, we're going to take phone calls with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. By the way, let me get my website out for you, coasttocoastam.com, with the email george@coasttocoastam.com. Back in a moment with James D. Eugenio in his book, Destiny Betrayed, on Coast to Coast AM. This hour, we're going to take your phone calls with James D. Eugenio, his book, Destiny Betrayed. And we're going to get to you when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast to Coast. James, the Truman meeting with Dulles, why was that so important?
Well, this is, when I got the documents on this, I was really, really startled for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's important to lay the background in of why Dulles went out to Missouri to meet Truman at this time. In December of 1963, Truman wrote this very famous editorial that only ran in a very few newspapers. And it essentially said that the CIA needed to be reformed because it had drifted off of its original mission plan. Now, in my research on this, I discovered that although this editorial was published 1 month after Kennedy was killed, December the 22nd, Truman actually began writing the article a little more than a week after Kennedy's assassination. And then he had a draft version ready on December 9th, which he showed to a couple other people. And then it was handed in, and it ran on December the 22nd, 1963. Now, Allen Dulles goes out to visit Truman in April of 1964 while he's serving on the Warren Commission. All right? He goes to his house. He tells his two assistants to wait out in the foyer area. He goes into a private study with Truman. And his intent is to get Truman to retract his editorial. In other words, take it back. Right? Which is really something when you think about it. Right? So now he fails in this mission, obviously, to get Truman to take it back. But right before he leaves, as they're walking out, he turns to Truman, and out of the blue, he says words of the effect that, those stories in the New York Times about Kennedy clashing with the CIA over Vietnam, those were denied by Kennedy. Now, when I read this, I was really kind of floored because, there is something in the law that prosecutors will tell you, which is called consciousness of guilt, which means if you're thinking something that you really shouldn't be thinking, you're doing it in order to hide some kind of criminal intent.
Right.
Well, at this particular time, in April of 1964, nobody that I know of had connected Kennedy and Vietnam and his death the way that he was insinuating here. Nobody. And by the way, he's also lying because Kennedy never did deny those stories. All right? So the inescapable conclusion that I came to after reading these documents is that Dulles thought that Truman wrote the editorial because that's what he was thinking. That's what Truman was thinking. And this is as close as he could come to expressing that thought. In other words, the CIA was out of control, and they had killed Kennedy over his changing Vietnam policy. And that's what Dulles suspected about Truman. Now, that is really something, you know, when you really think of it.
He was feeling guilty.
In April of 1964, you know.
Why, James, were there just no convictions here? I mean,
why was there no what?
No convictions here. They didn't nail anybody. They buried the Oswald story. You know, they created him as the lone gunman. I mean, why didn't anybody step up to the plate?
Oh, you mean that's a kind of simple question, because very early in the process, the Warren Commission was stuck with the FBI as their investigating arm. If you read the Warren report, you'll see that 85% of the investigation was run by the FBI. And of course, you and I and most of your listeners know that if you're saying it was run by the FBI, you're really saying it was run by J. Edgar Hoover.
That's right. And he hated
it. Because Hoover at that time controlled the FBI with an iron fist. Now, many FBI agents, including one that I know, a guy named Bill Turner up in San Francisco, told me that very clearly in the first couple of days, maybe in the first hours, Hoover decided they're going to go with the Oswald story, all right? And they're going to bury this thing. You know, every conspiracy lead is going to be shortchanged, discounted, or completely blocked off. And the extent to which this was done is really remarkable, because you have FBI agents who later said that Hoover actually rewrote reports. You know, reports were made to be rewritten when they went too far into a conspiratorial direction.
Was he complicit in this?
Well, I don't think there's any question Hoover was complicit in the cover-up. You know, whether he's complicit in the conspiracy, that's a different question.
Right.
I don't really know. I've never seen any evidence that Hoover was actually complicit in the conspiracy. You know, but there's no doubt he jumped on the cover-up the very day that it happened. And, of course, this was because he understood that the Kennedys were going to fire him. You know, if there was another election and Kennedy got reelected, they were going to fire Hoover. RFK and Hoover despised each other. You know, and so now that Johnson was coming in and Johnson and Hoover were the best of friends, you know, Robert Kennedy really didn't have any power left over Hoover. And within 2 weeks, Kennedy had moved a private phone into Hoover's office, which he expected Hoover to answer whenever he called him. In 2 weeks after his brother's death, that phone was moved out.
That was gone, yeah.
Kennedy RFK now really didn't have any control over Hoover. The other problem, as I see it, is I think today most people will tell you, and if you read those 2 chapters in my book, I spent 2 chapters on all the new discoveries about Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, to put it slightly, you know, mildly, was not what the Warren Commission said he was. Lee Harvey Oswald was an intelligence operative who was indoctrinated in the Marines, and he was sent over as part of the false defector program into the Soviet Union to try and penetrate Soviet intelligence. When he couldn't do this because the KGB was onto him very early, and they essentially were surveilling him instead of him surveilling them with human intelligence and electronic surveillance in his apartment in Minsk, he was called back, and then he became part of this anti-Fair Play for Cuba operation that the CIA had.
It was a
which
cover.
Was being run by David Phillips and James McCord.
Yeah.
All right? Many people, including myself, believe he was also, in addition to being a CIA agent provocateur, he was also an FBI informant. And Hoover did not want that to come out. So that's why he had to bury the investigation.
Let's take some calls here. Wayne in Colfax, Iowa. You're up with us. Go ahead, Wayne.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I'm just curious. I heard somewhere along the lines, I listen to a lot of these on TV and your show, of course. Wasn't the route that he was on when he got shot a secondary route, a last-minute decision to go that way instead of the way they originally planned? And if that's the case, how would all these gunmen know where to set up?
Was that changed?
Okay.
Was that route changed?
See what I'm getting?
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about this, about whether or not the motorcade route was altered. All right, it certainly was altered from the one that was announced in the local Dallas papers about a week or so earlier. You know, whether it was altered in their own itinerary, you know, where the Secret Service knew they were going, that's a different question. Okay. There's no doubt that the Secret Service violated almost every aspect of their practice by okaying that motorcade route. It should have never, ever been approved for a dozen different reasons. I mean, if you've ever been there and you saw this thing, it's a joke. I mean, you have the car slowing down to 11 miles per hour, then taking a right turn, then taking a dogleg turn. Right behind the car, there's these high buildings with a parking lot. Right in front of the car, there's a stockade fence with a parking lot. So there's easy entry and easy exit, you know, once you've done the job. So, you know, whether or not that was the approved route is a question. Whether or not it was a horrendous choice by the Secret Service, there's no question at all about that.
How many people were on the no, James, that day? What do you think?
Okay, this isn't something that I specialize in, but it's something, you know, that I've done a lot of thinking about. You know, I believe that there were three sniper teams. I think one was at the end of the stockade fence, what we call the grassy knoll, over a storm drain at the end. All right, I think there was one in the depository building, and I think there was one in the Dell Tex building next to the depository building. Now, if you talk to military guys, what this does is this produces what they call the perfect L-shaped ambush, in the sense that the target is going on an L route, taking a turn off of Maine onto Houston, then onto Elm, and you have an assassin at each point, at the beginning of the L, at the curve in the L, and at the end of the L. So therefore, it's what they call an overkill operation. There's no escape.
It's the triangular shoot, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
Next up, let's go to Scott, Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for taking the call. I saw a documentary, and it was on cable, one of the History Channels or National Geographic, and it featured the guy who ran the windshield division of the, I guess, GM factory in Detroit. And he was called the night of the assassination and was told to bring two people he could trust to the plant to replace the front windshield, which was being flown in on a C-141 or something like that. And this guy said that there were several bullet holes in the front windshield, and he had actually assembled his whole family in front of him because this guy was now dying of cancer, because he didn't want any of them to get hurt, so he wanted them all on record. And I guess they fixed the windshield that night, and they had it flown back out. And I wonder if you had seen that documentary, you know, and I've tried to track it down. They don't air it anymore, and you can't find it.
Yeah, they did something very fast with that limousine, didn't they?
Well, what this gentleman is talking about is, well, it's a very, very serious matter, okay? And I don't think there was more than one hole in the windshield, because you take a look at the Zapruder film, I think that there might have been one hole in the window shield, okay, in that front windshield. All right? And what he's talking about is a lot of research that's gone into this about a so-called windshield swipe. In other words, they got rid of this one windshield, okay, which clearly showed a hole coming in from the front, and they replaced it with a fake windshield that was really not on the car. Now, there's a fair amount of evidence for this because there's, if I remember correctly, the late Doug Weldon. Doug Weldon was an attorney who did a lot of work on this point, and he actually wrote an essay on this.
Well, they tampered with evidence then, James.
Oh, yeah, well, I don't think there's any question about that. You know, he counted something like, I think, 6 or 7 witnesses who said that when the car pulled up to Parkland Hospital and they took Kennedy's body out, 6 or 7 people noticed this through and through hole in the front windshield, which, of course, the only way that would happen is through with a bullet. Okay,
but it could have come. It could have come from the back out instead of the front in.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. But most of the witnesses seem to think, you know, that it came from the front, from the way that the bullet hole looked. Okay, now if that's true, then what this gentleman caller who called in a couple minutes ago, that story follows them. And Doug Weldon did find a witness who said that the windshield was changed. Now, you just mentioned, George, a very good point about tampering with evidence. I'm sure you know another problem with the car is the bizarre story that a Secret Service agent, when the car was at Parkland Hospital, actually took a bucket and a sponge and started wiping down the inside of the car.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is absolutely preposterous. All right? So, yes, there definitely was an alteration of the crime scene.
Which is the worst police you could do.
Yeah, it really is.
And this is the death of the president. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, many people think that was not an accident. You know, that the wiping down of the inside of the car, that wasn't an accident.
Right, exactly. And there might have been some prints there on things they wanted to get rid of. Who knows?
Well, there might have been not just that, but there might have been a kind of blood splatter pattern that they did not want to stay there.
That's right. That's absolutely true. Next up, we go to Pennsylvania. Jim's turn east of the Rockies. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes. I think one of the things that I've found over the years that makes it hard to discuss the assassination is most folks are not aware of a couple of basic things. Now, if you're in the business, you know something that a conspiracy under Title 18, Section 371 of the United States Code defines, it basically talks about a conspiracy as one or more people conspiring to do something that's illegal under federal statute. See, most people think if you have a lone gunman, there's no conspiracy, and that's not true. They think conspiracy equals 2 or more gunmen. So where I'm going at is this. There was a guy named George de Mortenshield, and I might be pronouncing his name incorrectly. I don't know if you've come across that name.
Yeah, we were talking about him
I'm sorry, I tuned in a little bit later.
That's right.
But the bottom line is, I believe he facilitated Oswald getting the job at the book depository on or about October 15th of 1963. Now, if he did that with the intent, and as you mentioned earlier, that was a perfect, Dealey Plaza was a perfect, what they call choke point in terms of a protection detail. They try to avoid those usually. They don't want cars to slow down. On-ramps, off-ramps, those are choke points because you're forcing the motorcade to slow down. So what you're allowing is the protectee to become a target. Now, if he facilitated Oswald obtaining a job there, and even if Oswald was the lone gunman, if he or somebody else purchased the weapon for Oswald, they could be co-conspirators.
Well, that's true. Let's hold on for a second. We're going to come back in just a moment on Coast to Coast.
Sure.
And let's go back to Jim in Pennsylvania. Jim, I know you've been on hold for a while, so I'll get right to you. And, you
I
are
appreciate
right.
it. I might have lost a little bit of momentum regarding conspiracy, what I was talking about, but I'm just saying that the federal statutes are quite clear that it's just more than one person conspiring to do an illegal act. Now, both people don't have to do the act. The co-conspirators can be involved in the planning. Now, earlier you mentioned a Secret Service agent who washed the inside of a vehicle. If that was part of trying to cover up something, that person would also be a co-conspirator. Personally, I would not say that Secret Service agent was probably part of something. I think that one of the things you have to slice very carefully is there was the grief associated with this event that can skewer somebody's judgment regarding.
Yeah, but these people are professionals, though, Jimmy. These people are law enforcement experts. They should not get emotional.
You're right, and I agree with you totally. Even law enforcement personnel sometimes and many times make mistakes about those things. But I think one of the most ridiculous things about the lone gunman theory and people who stick to this, it was Oswald acted alone, is simply the magic bullet itself. In the history of ballistics, if I've got this right, they found this bullet on a stretcher. In the history of ballistics, has a round ever fallen out of a body and lain next to it, on a stretcher? I mean, that's just not reality. And, and holding that up is the object that killed John F. Kennedy. It's ridiculous.
I know.
Any ballistics expert will tell you that's just not possible.
Well, will we ever get the answers? That's the thing. Jim Lau, let you wrap up. Go ahead.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is, when you attack that one thing, and if you were to successfully bring it down, then the whole house of cards starts to fall down. If you attack the bullet, if you had enough people talking about this thing, that's just not possible. We've never seen that before. How did that? You would have to have a physician actually extract the bullet from the body. Where's the note? Who's the witness? Now that round was placed where it was by somebody, again, a co-conspirator, and that's the frustrating thing. People are walking around who helped plan this event, and they were never charged. Thank you for taking my call.
All right, and we'll be back with more calls in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. James, next year will be the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Kennedy. Will we ever see any more documents? Is there anything out there that might be of any scope and magnitude to help us get the answers here?
Oh, well, I don't think there's any question that even after the ARB, there's documents the ARB did not get to. And there's more than one person who has been at the National Archives that will tell you that that's the case. In retrospect, although the ARB was a very good idea, the ARB was, number one, undermanned. They didn't have enough people working for them. Number two, it was underfunded. They didn't have enough money. And number three, it didn't last long enough. It lasted about 4 years, but it actually took them quite a while to get up and running. So they were really only operating for about 3 years. And the amount of documents the federal government is hiding on this, made it, I think, pretty much impossible to do the job in that period of time under those circumstances. So the answer to your question, yes, I do believe that there's some important documents that are still out there. Now, are they enough to actually solve this case once and for all? I kind of doubt that. I think we've come about pretty close to doing the best job we possibly can now. So I don't think there's going to be any literal smoking gun documents in there. But although there's still information coming out, I mean, I'm sure you know about the famous Curtis LeMay tape, right?
Tell me more about that.
Okay. Last year, they discovered that the Air Force One tape that was recorded as the plane was leaving Dallas and going back to Washington
All right.
They found a missing segment on it. And this is one of the things the ARB was looking for, because most people believe that that tape on Air Force One was edited. In other words, the one we have at the National Archives was not the whole tape. Well, it turns out somebody found a certain part of that tape, about 20 minutes of it. And part of this tape, on part of this tape that we can hear now, a guy named Colonel Dorman, who is Curtis LeMay's aide-de-camp, is trying to locate where LeMay is in the air at that time as the plane is going back to Washington, and he's doing it through Air Force One. Now, why is that so interesting? Because most people know that LeMay and Kennedy knocked heads during the missile crisis. LeMay wanted to go ahead and invade the island and bomb the island, which we now, of course, know would have led inevitably to World War III and nuclear holocaust, because the Russians had moved in tactical nuclear weapons to stop any invasion, of Cuba. And those tactical nuclear weapons had a range of 90 miles. That was the cruise missiles. And then what they call the Luna land-to-land missiles had a range of 30 miles. So any invasion force would have been vaporized, and that would have provoked World War III undoubtedly.
No,
right?
No question. No question.
And then the other thing is that LeMay was much more hawkish on Vietnam than Kennedy was. Kennedy wanted to withdraw. So, and finally, let me put the last link into this puzzle. There's more than one report that says that LeMay was at Bethesda. In other words, the medical center where the body, Kennedy's body, ended up that night. And, of course, one of the things I detail in my book is at the trial of Clay Shaw, Dr. Pierre Fink testified on the stand under oath as to the question, why did the pathologist not dissect the track of Kennedy's back wound? In other words, why didn't they split it open to see if it came from the front or came from the back, and whether or not it went all the way through Kennedy's body? Well, Fink did not want to answer that question. He avoided it like 8 times.
Gosh.
Finally, the attorney asked the judge to request the witness to answer the question. And when Fink had to answer the question, he finally said, because they were told not to by a certain general who was in the room that night. So in other words, the military was controlling the autopsy of President Kennedy, and some witnesses say LeMay was there. And LeMay was, through his assistant, was being tracked that afternoon. So this leads to the question, was it LeMay who was telling these doctors not to dissect the back wound? Okay, now, I don't have to tell your listeners why that's such an important operation, because there's been years of debate on whether or not that wound actually went all the way through Kennedy and from which direction it was fired.
Well, and
we're never going to really know, although we have very strong suspicions about it, but we're never really going to know because the pathologists did not do their job. And we now know that they were stopped by the military, maybe Curtis LeMay.
And it had that bullet been fired from the front, we knew Oswald either, one, didn't do it, or two, there were many gunmen.
Correct.
Scott in San Diego, welcome to the program. Scott, go ahead.
Hi, George. It's Thanksgiving. We have a lot to be thankful for. Your program, of course. And, Jim, your dedication and your tenacity. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I think the other caller was on the right track. I know you don't like to talk about the single bullet theory, but even with a lie, we can learn something. For instance, I believe in the Garrison case against Clay Shaw, it came out in the trial, and we're talking over 40 years ago, that more lead was lost from the so-called magic bullet than is missing from the bullet itself. And it remains in Governor Connolly today, who's buried somewhere in Texas. The other thing is, when they test-fired the rifle at goat carcasses through bone and even human cadavers, they never could get a bullet to match the pristine condition of the so-called magic bullet, no matter how they tried up at, I believe, Edgewood Arsenal in western Maryland. So even from a lie, we can learn something about the case. So it's more of a statement than a question. If you want to comment on it, that'll be great. And Jim, this is Scott down in San Diego, and I just appreciate your work. I've been following you for years.
There you go, Jim.
Thank you, Scott. Well, he's correct, of course. When they did try and test fire the rifle, they couldn't get a bullet that is as unscathed and as pristine as CE-399. And yes, there is very likely more lead in Conley's body than is missing from the bullet, which, of course, is impossible because the whole cannot be greater than the sum of its parts. All right? So, yeah, this is all. The single bullet theory is, I talk a little bit about this in the book. The single bullet theory, the magic bullet, whatever you want to call it, was simply a diversion. And it was a diversion at that time. And the people who made it up, mainly Arlen Specter, as backed up by the Warren Commission, understood that they were covering something up, that what they were talking about was pretty much impossible. And today, of course, there's even stronger evidence that it never happened, okay, because through the work of John Hunt, we now know that Robert Frazier, the FBI agent in Washington, received something called the stretcher bullet at 7:30 the night of the assassination, which is impossible because Elmer Lee Todd, the FBI agent who's supposed to deliver that to him, didn't get CE-399, the stretcher bullet, until 8:45. So how could Frazier have the stretcher bullet before Elmer Todd gave it to him? Which implies, of course, that either there were 4 bullets or somebody switched the bullets. Either way, you have a conspiracy. Further, the bullet we have today in evidence at the National Archives, although Hoover said that Elmer Lee Todd's initials are on that bullet, John Hunt went to the National Archives and inspected the magnified pictures, which are the entire circumference of the bullet. And guess what, George? I know this is going to shock you, but Elmer Lee Todd's initials are not on the bullet. How could they not be on the bullet if he's the guy who's supposed to deliver it to Frazier?
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing was rotten. Will we ever get the answers, James?
Right. And in fact, what this shows you, what I just told you, is what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, that Hoover jumped into the cover-up on the very night of the assassination. All right? And by the way, the man who was supposed to have discovered CE-399 on that stretcher, by the way, and by the way, if your listeners don't know this, the stretcher that he found the bullet on was not Conley's stretcher, which it has to be if CE-399 has any viability, because the Warren Commission says the bullet went through Kennedy and then Conley and then fell out of his upper thigh onto the stretcher. Well, Josiah Thompson, in his book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, proves very powerfully that that was not Conley's stretcher. Okay, but even beyond that, even beyond these points, that I'm trying to make, Conley said that a bullet fell out of him on the stretcher onto the floor.
So how to get back on the stretcher, right?
So, that's the question. How could something like that happen? Obviously, it wasn't the same bullet then. And this is an article we have on our website, ctka.net, by Bob Harris. It's called The Conley Bullet.
These people thought this thing out, James. is.
Yeah, see, this thing is, and this is why your caller, Scott, said, I don't like talking about the single bullet theory because I think it's just a bunch of malarkey that was meant to mislead us from the beginning, that we now have argued about for over 40 years, something that never existed.
And they needed that. That was the whole basis of the whole argument.
Right. And by the way, how many of your listeners know that the Warren Commission stood alone on this? The FBI, if you take a look at their diagram, they don't buy the single bullet theory. Okay? They have a separate bullet for Connally, a separate bullet for Kennedy. The CIA, the night that they got the information, including the Zapruder film, they came to the conclusion that there were two assassins firing from two different directions, and there were 5 or 6 bullets fired. So in other words, the Warren Commission is saying one thing, the FBI is saying something else, and the CIA is saying something else, all about the same event. Try and bring that into a court of law and see how long you last.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. Will we ever get the answers?
I sure hope so.
Let's take one or two more calls. Mike in Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, George. I try to make this quick.
Sure.
I have a real sixth sense that dead people talk to me. And one night, Jackie O came to me and says, I want you to tell everyone that Jack was buried with a plastic head. And I said, well, what do I get out of this? And so she led me into a room. There was diamonds, jewelry, you name it, platinum, money. Mm-hmm. And I said, could I look around? She said, sure, look around. So I looked around. I found a picture of her and Jack. 3 months later, I find it in a thrift store. So I'm just wondering, do you think Jack was actually buried with a plastic head?
Plastic head? I don't think so.
Is he asking me that?
Yeah.
I mean, anyone.
No, I don't.
Because I know at one time the Navy took a bunch of Kennedy stuff and buried it at sea somewhere, undisclosed.
No, that wasn't a bunch of Kennedy. That was the coffin.
Okay.
Okay. That was the coffin. Now, what might be
the coffin?
What might be a little kernel of truth in that is this. It turned out that one of the things that the ARB investigated was whether or not the pictures of Kennedy's brain taken during the autopsy were actually Kennedy's brain. All right, because most people believe that the pictures that we do have show such little damage that they're very suspect. All right? There's only a very little disturbance in one part of the brain. Yet, if you count the witnesses at Parkland and at Bethesda who say that there was tremendous damage to Kennedy's brain, there's quite a lot of them. There's like 11 or 12.
Well, the one thing that is indeed true, we have never been the same since. James, thank you so much. Destiny Betrayed. That is our John F. Kennedy special for this year, live Thanksgiving show. For Dave Buginski, Dan Galante, Tom Dan Heiser, John Howie, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Stephanie Smith, George Knapp, John B. Wells, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.